Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you. Today, I know you used this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable. I had been broken for months. Not physically, though my body carried the weight of sleepless nights and forgotten meals. It was deeper than that, a fracturing that happened when Sarah died, when the cancer took her piece by piece until there was nothing left but an empty space where my wife used to be. The grief counselor said I needed time, needed space to process. My sister said I needed to get back to work, back to normal. But normal felt like a foreign language I'd forgotten how to speak. That's when I found the listing online. A lighthouse keeper's cottage, available for monthly rental on the coast of Maine. The photographs showed a weathered white tower standing sentinel against gray skies, with a small keeper's house nestled at its base. The description was sparse, fully furnished, private beach access, no neighbors for miles. Perfect for someone seeking solitude and reflection. The price was surprisingly reasonable for waterfront property, and when I called the number listed, an elderly woman with a thick Maine accent assured me it was exactly what I needed. "Ayo, it's peaceful there," she said, her voice crackling through the phone. "Nothing but you and the sea." Though I should mention the lighthouse hasn't been operational for near 30 years now. Coast Guard automated everything, you understand. But the cottage is comfortable enough, and the view. She paused, and I heard something like wind in the background. Well, you'll see for yourself. I drove up from Boston on a Thursday morning in late September, my car loaded with enough supplies to last a month. The GPS led me down increasingly narrow roads until I was following a dirt track that wound through scrub pines and salt-weathered rocks. When I finally crested the last hill, the lighthouse stood before me like something from a maritime painting, tall and stark against the pewter sky, its red roof bright as a wound. The keeper's cottage was smaller than I'd expected, but charming in its simplicity. Whitewashed walls, blue shutters, a small porch that faced the sea. Mrs. Caldwell, the woman I'd spoken with on the phone, was waiting for me with the keys. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. "Welcome to Beacon Point," she said, shaking my hand with surprising strength. "I hope you find what you're looking for here." She showed me through the cottage quickly, a living room with a stone fireplace, a compact kitchen, one bedroom with windows that looked out over the water. Everything was clean but dated, furnished with pieces that spoke of decades of use. The walls were decorated with maritime charts and faded photographs of ships. And there was a persistent smell of salt and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. The previous keeper lived here for 43 years, Mrs. Caldwell explained as we stood in the kitchen. Ezra Whitmore, dedicated man. Even after they shut down the light, he stayed on as caretaker until she trailed off, her fingers worrying at the hem of her cardigan. "Until when?" I asked. "Until he passed, of course. Natural causes, nothing to worry about. That was, must be 15 years ago now." She handed me the keys, her fingers cold, despite the mild weather. The tide schedule's on the refrigerator. High tides at 6:13 this evening, low at 12:47. You'll want to pay attention to that if you plan on walking the beach. After she left, I spent the afternoon settling in, unpacking my clothes and books, familiarizing myself with the cottage's quirks. The water pressure was weak, the floorboards creaked in specific patterns, and there was a persistent ticking sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. By evening, I had a fire going in the fireplace and was sitting with a cup of tea, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. That's when I noticed something odd. According to the tide schedule, Mrs. Caldwell had left. High tide should have been at 6:13, but looking out at the water, the tide appeared to be going out, not coming in. The beach stretched wide and empty, littered with seaweed and shells. I checked my watch 6:30. Perhaps the schedule was old, or I was misreading the signs. I made myself dinner and tried to read, but found my attention drifting to the windows. The lighthouse loomed dark against the deepening sky, its light chamber empty and cold. There was something unsettling about its presence, the way it seemed to watch over the cottage with blank, unseeing eyes. When I finally went to bed around 11, I could hear the ocean in the distance, but it sounded wrong, somehow too rhythmic, too deliberate, like breathing. I woke at 3 in the morning to absolute silence, not the peaceful quiet of a remote location, but something deeper and more complete. No wind, no waves, no settling sounds from the old cottage. I lay in bed, listening to my own heartbeat, feeling increasingly uneasy. When I got up to look out the window, what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The ocean was gone, where water should have been. There was only empty beach stretching out into darkness. Not just low tide, the water had vanished entirely, revealing a seabed that extended far beyond what should have been possible. In the moonlight, I could see strange shapes scattered across the exposed ocean floor, dark mounds that might have been rocks, or something else entirely. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, my bare feet cold against the wooden porch. The air smelled different now, not of salt and sea, but of something ancient and organic, like soil that had been underwater for centuries. The silence was so complete, it seemed to press against my eardrums. I walked to the edge of what had been the high tide line, my flashlight beam dancing across the impossible landscape before me. The sand was firm beneath my feet, packed hard by the weight of vanished water. As I ventured further out, I began to make sense of the shapes I'd seen from the cottage window. They were structures, the remains of buildings, their foundations, exposed like broken teeth. A village. There had been a village here, beneath the water. I should have been terrified, should have run back to the cottage and called someone, anyone. But grief had made me reckless, and the mystery pulled at me like a tide of its own. I walked among the ruins, my flashlight revealing stone foundations, the skeleton of what might have been a church steeple, the rusted remains of a car that couldn't have been more than 20 years old. That's when I heard the voice. The tide's not coming back. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping wildly, but saw nothing. The voice had been clear, conversational, as if someone were standing right beside me. A man's voice, weathered and tired. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. "Is someone there?" Silence stretched out like a held breath. Then, from somewhere behind me, "Not anymore." I ran then, stumbling across the uneven seabed, my flashlight beam bouncing crazily as I made my way back to the cottage. By the time I reached the porch, my heart was hammering, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I locked it behind me and stood with my back against it, listening. Nothing. Just that terrible, complete silence. When I looked out the window again, the ocean had returned. Waves lapped gently at the shore, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just walked across miles of exposed seabed. I checked the tide schedule again. Low tide had been at 12:47. It was now 3:25, well into the incoming tide cycle. Everything was exactly as it should be. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning brought gray skies and a steady drizzle that seemed to wash away the strangeness of the previous evening. In daylight, the ocean looked perfectly normal, and I began to convince myself that I'd had some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Grief could do strange things to the mind, I knew. The counselor had warned me about this, how trauma could manifest in unexpected ways. I spent the day reading and trying to relax, but found myself constantly checking the windows, watching the tide come and go according to its normal schedule. By evening, I was feeling more settled. I made dinner, built another fire, and settled in with a book about lighthouse history I'd found on the cottage's bookshelf. That's when I learned about Millfield. The book was a comprehensive history of Maine lighthouses, and Beacon Point had its own chapter, according to the text. The lighthouse had been built in 1847 to guide ships safely past a dangerous reef system, but there was more to the story. In 1923, during a particularly violent storm, the entire village of Millfield, which had been built on the lowlands behind the lighthouse, had been swept away by a massive storm surge. 43 people had died. Their bodies never recovered. The village had been rebuilt on higher ground, but abandoned entirely in 1954 when the fishing industry collapsed. The lighthouse had continued to operate until 1975, when it was automated and the keeper's position eliminated. The last keeper, Ezra Whitmore, had been granted permission to remain in the cottage as caretaker until his death in 2008. I closed the book with trembling hands. The ruins I'd seen the night before, they had been real. The village of Millfield, lost beneath the waves for nearly a century, revealed when the impossible happened and the tide simply ... stopped. As if summoned by my thoughts, the voice came, again, clearer this time, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. You're beginning to understand. I looked around the empty cottage, my pulse quickening. Understand why the tide stopped, why it won't come back. That's impossible, I said aloud, feeling foolish for engaging with what had to be my own fractured psyche. Tides don't just stop. They do when someone holds them back. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The fire in the fireplace flickered and dimmed, as if something were drawing away its warmth. "Who are you?" I whispered. "I was the keeper here. For 43 years, I kept the light burning, kept the ships safe from the reef. Even after they turned off the light, I stayed. Someone had to watch over them. Over who? The ones who never left Millfield." I stood up slowly, every instinct telling me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cottage felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in like the hull of a sinking ship. "Ezra," I said. "Ezra Whitmore." The silence stretched out, and then I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of footsteps above me. Slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the cottage's second floor. But there was no second floor. I'd been through the entire building. I tried to let them rest. The voice continued, and now I could place its source. It was coming from above, from the impossible footsteps. For 15 years after I died, I tried to let them sleep beneath the water, but they're restless now. They know someone's here who understands loss, who knows what it means to be left behind. The footsteps stopped directly above where I stood. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, though I could see no cracks or gaps in the plaster. "They want to come home," Ezra said, "and I can't hold the tide back much longer." I backed toward the door, but my hand froze on the handle. Through the window, I could see the ocean again beginning to recede, the water pulling back to reveal the dark expanse of seabed. But this time, I could see figures moving out, their shapes that walked upright among the ruins. Dozens of them, making their way slowly toward shore. "They've been waiting so long." Ezra's voice was fading now, becoming distant and hollow. Waiting for someone who could see them, who could understand. "Sarashi's with them now. She's been calling to you." My wife's name hit me like a physical blow. That's not possible. Sarah's buried in Boston. I was at her funeral. Bodies are just shells. She's been waiting with the others, in the deep places where the drowned go. She wants you to join them, to stop fighting the current and let yourself sink. I could see them more clearly now, the figures walking across the exposed seabed. Men, women, children, all moving with the slow, deliberate gait of those who had learned to walk underwater. Their clothes hung in tatters, their hair flowed as if still submerged, and their eyes were dark holes that reflected no light. And there, among them, I saw a figure I recognized, smaller than the others, wearing a blue dress. I'd bought her for our anniversary. "Sarah," walking with the drowned residents of Millfield, her face pale as sea foam, her lips moving in words I couldn't hear. "She's been so lonely," Ezra whispered. "They all have. The water's cold and dark, and there's nothing there but silence. But you could change that. You could join them, and they wouldn't be alone anymore." The cottage door swung open on its own, letting in the smell of exposed seabed and rotting kelp. The figures were closer now, close enough that I could see the barnacles that had grown on their skin, the seaweed tangled in their hair. Sarah was in the front, her arms outstretched, her mouth open in a soundless call. I wanted to go to her. The grief that had been eating at me for months suddenly seemed like a small price to pay for this reunion. What was life without her, anyway? What was the point of healing when the wound would never truly close? I took a step toward the door, then another. The cold air wrapped around me like embracing arms, and I could almost hear Sarah's voice now, calling my name across the impossible distance between life and death. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. Among the approaching figures, there were others, people who didn't belong to 1923, who wore modern clothes and had died more recently. A man in a business suit, a woman in jogging clothes, a teenager with a backpack, all walking with the same underwater gait, all bearing the same marks of the deep. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ezra's presence seemed to solidify beside me, and for a moment I could see him, a tall man in his 70s, wearing a keeper's uniform that looked decades out of date. His eyes were kind, but infinitely sad. "Everyone who came here looking for what you're looking for," he said. "Everyone who is broken enough to see them, lonely enough to listen. The cottage calls to people like you, people who've lost everything that matters. And they come, and they see the ones who've been waiting, and they choose to join them rather than face the pain of living. You're saying I'm not the first? You're the 37th since I died. Each time, I try to hold the tide back, try to give them a choice. But grief is a powerful current, and most people choose to stop swimming." I looked out at the approaching figures, at Sarah's beloved face, and felt the pull of that dark water. It would be so easy to walk out there, to let them take me down to the quiet places where nothing hurt anymore. "But you're still here," I said to Ezra. "You chose to stay. I had a duty. 43 years of keeping the light, of protecting people from the reef. Old habits die hard, even when you're dead yourself." He smiled sadly. "But I'm tired now, so very tired. And if you choose to go to them, I think I'll finally rest too." The figures were almost at the shore now. I could see Sarah's face clearly, could see the love in her dark eyes, the promise of an end to all the pain and loneliness. Behind her, the residents of Millfield waited patiently, as they had been waiting for nearly a century. I closed my eyes and thought about the life I'd left behind in Boston. The empty apartment, the job I'd taken leave from, the friends who didn't know what to say anymore. The future that stretched ahead like a gray ocean, full of days I'd have to get through without her. Then I thought about the lighthouse, standing dark and empty for 30 years. About Ezra, holding back the tide through sheer force of will, trying to protect people even in death. About duty and purpose, and the choice between surrender and service. When I opened my eyes, Sarah was standing at the water's edge, her hand extended toward me. The love in her face was real, I knew that, but so was the darkness behind her eyes, the hunger of the deep places that had claimed her. "I love you," I said to her, and meant it with every fiber of my being, "but I can't come with you. Not yet." Her face crumpled with disappointment, and for a moment she looked like the woman I'd married, the woman who'd fought the cancer with such fierce determination. Then the expression faded, replaced by something older and more patient. "We'll wait," she said, her voice carrying across the impossible distance. "We'll always wait." The figures began to retreat, walking backward into the deeper parts of the exposed seabed. Sarah was the last to go, her eyes locked on mine until she disappeared into the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I turned to where Ezra had been standing, but he was gone too. The cottage felt empty now, but not abandoned, expectant, like a lighthouse waiting for its keeper to return. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching the tide slowly return. By morning, the ocean looked normal again, waves lapping peacefully at the shore, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better now. I understood what this place was, what it offered, and what it demanded in return. I called Mrs. Caldwell that afternoon and told her I wanted to extend my stay indefinitely. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, dear?" she asked finally. "It can be ... lonely out there, I'm sure," I said, looking out at the lighthouse. "Someone needs to keep watch." That was 3 months ago. I've learned to read the real tide schedule now, the one that exists beneath the official charts. I know when the water will recede and the drowned will walk, and I'm always ready. Sometimes I see Sarah among them, and it still hurts. But I also see the others, the recent arrivals, who might still be saved, who haven't yet chosen to join the deep places. Last week, I convinced a young man to turn back, a father who'd lost his daughter in a car accident. The week before, it was an elderly woman whose husband had died after 60 years of marriage. They come here broken, looking for an end to pain. And I try to show them that there are other choices. I'm not Ezra, don't have his decades of experience, or his supernatural endurance. But I have something else, the fresh memory of grief, the understanding of what it means to want to stop swimming. And sometimes, that's enough. The lighthouse still doesn't work. But I've been reading about restoration projects, about the possibility of bringing the light back to life. It seems fitting somehow to take something that's been dark for 30 years and make it shine again. Tonight, as I write this, I can feel the tide beginning to turn. Soon the water will recede, and they'll come walking across the seabed again, the drowned residents of Millfield, the recent dead, and Sarah, always Sarah, with her patient eyes and her endless invitation to join her in the deep. But I'll be here, keeping watch, holding the line between the living and the dead. Because someone has to. Because grief, I've learned, isn't something you escape from, it's something you learn to carry. Like a lighthouse keeper tends his light through the longest, darkest nights, and in the morning, when the tide returns and the dead retreat to their underwater rest, I'll still be here, still breathing, still choosing the difficult work of living over the easy surrender of drowning. The rain is starting now, drumming against the cottage windows like fingers tapping out a message in Morse code. In its rhythm, I can almost hear Ezra's voice, thanking me for taking up his watch. And beneath that, fainter but still audible, I hear Sarah calling my name, across the dark water, patient as the tide itself. But I'm not ready to answer. Not yet. My dead neighbor still leaves notes outside my door. Close your eyes and listen to the rain. Let it wash over you like a gentle whisper, each drop carrying secrets from somewhere far away. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, I want to share something with you, something that happened to me in the quiet hours when the world thinks it's sleeping. The rain outside your window tonight reminds me of the rain that fell the night I first found her note. So pull your blankets close, let your breathing slow, and listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that feel like they could happen to anyone, in any building, on any rainy night like this one. I moved into apartment 4B on Maple Street in October, drawn by the reasonable rent and the promise of quiet neighbors. The building was old, but well maintained, with thick walls that muffled most sounds, and a landlord who seemed genuinely invested in keeping things peaceful. My next-door neighbor in 4A was Mrs. Helena Varga, an elderly woman I'd see occasionally in the hallway, always impeccably dressed despite her age, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun and a handbag. clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Our interactions were brief, but pleasant. She'd nod politely when we passed, sometimes commenting on the weather or asking if I'd received any mail meant for her. Apparently, the postal worker occasionally mixed up our addresses. Helena had a precise way of speaking, each word carefully chosen, and I noticed she always wore the same perfume, something floral and old-fashioned, that lingered in the hallway long after she'd passed. The first note appeared on a Thursday morning in late November. I was rushing to work when I nearly stepped on it. A small piece of cream-colored paper, folded neatly and placed directly in front of my door. My name, Sarah, was written on the outside in careful, old-fashioned cursive. Inside, in the same handwriting, was a simple message. The rain keeps me awake. Could you please turn down your music after 10? I was puzzled. I rarely played music, and when I did, it was never loud, certainly not after 10 at night. But I'd heard from other tenants that sound could travel strangely in old buildings, so I made a mental note to be extra conscious of noise levels. I folded the note and tucked it into my purse, intending to speak with Helena when I saw her next, but I didn't see her. Days passed, then a week, without any sign of my neighbor. The hallway felt different somehow, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Helena's absence created a vacuum that seemed to change the very air between our doors. I began to notice things I'd never paid attention to before: the way the overhead light flickered slightly near her apartment, how the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees right in front of her door. The second note appeared the following Tuesday, again positioned perfectly in front of my door. This time it read, "Thank you for being quieter. The rain sounds different now. Do you hear it too?" The handwriting was identical, that same precise cursive, but something about it felt slightly off, as if written by someone whose hand wasn't quite steady. I knocked on Helena's door that evening, the note in my hand, but there was no answer. No sound from within, no sense of movement or life. I pressed my ear to the door, feeling slightly foolish, but heard nothing except what might have been the faint sound of water dripping. I assumed she was visiting family or had gone away for an extended period, though it struck me as odd that she hadn't mentioned any travel plans. The notes continued to appear, always in the same spot, always in that careful handwriting. "The management office says you've been asking about me. There's no need for concern." Then, a few days later, "I can hear you pacing at night. Are you having trouble sleeping? The rain helps, if you listen closely." I hadn't been asking about Helena at the management office, but the notes made me increasingly curious about her absence. I finally worked up the courage to inquire with Mr. Davidson, the building superintendent, about whether everything was all right with my neighbor. His expression grew somber when I mentioned Helena Varga. "Oh dear," he said, removing his glasses to clean them slowly. "I'm afraid Mrs. Varga passed away 3 weeks ago, peaceful in her sleep. Her nephew came to collect her things, and the apartment's been cleaned out since then." I thought all the tenants had been notified. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. 3 weeks ago would have been right around the time the first note appeared. I showed Mr. Davidson the notes, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded them. He examined them carefully, his brow furrowed. "This does look like Helena's handwriting," he admitted. "She used to write the most beautiful thank you notes, but this can't be right. The apartment's been empty since the day after she passed." He looked at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Are you sure these were left at your door? Maybe someone's playing a prank, though I can't imagine who would do such a thing." I assured him the notes were real, but I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to question my mental state. He promised to look into it, but I knew he wouldn't find anything. How could he? What was there to find? That night, I lay in bed, listening to the rain against my windows, wondering if I was losing my mind. The rational part of me insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe Helena had written several notes before she died, and someone was playing an elaborate joke. Maybe I was more stressed than I realized, and was somehow manufacturing the whole experience. But as I listened to the rain, I could swear I heard something else, a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass, coming from the direction of Helena's apartment. The tapping continued for several nights, always in the same rhythm, always when the rain was heaviest. I began to keep a notebook, documenting each occurrence, timing them, trying to find a pattern. The tapping seemed to follow the rhythm of the rain, but not quite matching it, as if responding to it instead. On nights when there was no rain, there was no tapping. 2 weeks after my conversation with Mr. Davidson, another note appeared. This one was different. The paper looked older, slightly yellowed, and the ink had a faded quality that made the words seem to shimmer slightly in the hallway light. I know you spoke with Mr. Davidson. He means well, but he doesn't understand about the rain. It carries messages, Sarah. It carries us. The use of my name sent chills down my spine. In all my previous interactions with Helena, she had never called me by name. She'd been polite, but formal, the kind of neighbor who maintained respectful distance. But now, even in death, she seemed to know me intimately. I began to research Helena's history, spending hours at the local library and searching online records. What I found was both fascinating and disturbing. Helena Varga had lived in apartment 4A for 37 years, longer than any other tenant in the building's history. But before that, her life seemed to exist in fragments and gaps. She'd moved to the city in 1986, but there was no record of where she'd come from. Her employment history was sporadic, mostly temporary positions that never lasted more than a few months. She'd never married, had no children, and her only known relative was the nephew who'd claimed her body and belongings. Most intriguingly, I found a newspaper article from 1987 about a missing person case. A woman named Elena Vargas had disappeared from her apartment during a severe rainstorm, leaving behind all her possessions and no trace of where she might have gone. The name was so close to Helena Varga that it couldn't be a coincidence, but when I tried to find more information about the connection, I hit dead ends. Records seemed to have been lost or deliberately obscured. The notes began arriving more frequently, sometimes daily. The rain remembers everything, Sarah. It remembers Alina and Helena and all the names we wear. The handwriting was becoming less steady, the letters sometimes overlapping or trailing off into illegible scratches. Did you know that rain is just water that's died and been reborn? It falls from the sky carrying the memories of every place it's been, every life it's touched. I started leaving my own notes, sliding them under Helena's door in the middle of the night. "Who are you really?" I wrote. "What do you want from me?" The answers came with the morning rain. "I want you to remember me, Sarah. When we die, the only thing that truly matters is whether someone remembers our name." The building seemed to grow colder as December deepened. Other tenants began to complain about heating issues, but the maintenance crew could find nothing wrong with the system. The cold was worst in the hallway between our apartments, where my breath would mist even when the rest of the building felt warm. I started wearing a coat just to check my mail. On December 15th, during a particularly heavy rainstorm, I found a note that was different from all the others. The paper was not cream-colored but white, and it was soaking wet despite being folded. The ink had run slightly, making some words difficult to read. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me. In my apartment, behind the radiator in the bedroom, there's a box. Inside you'll find letters. Please read them. Please remember." The next morning, I spoke with Mr. Davidson about gaining access to Helena's apartment. I told him about the box, claiming that Helena had mentioned it to me before she died and asked me to retrieve something for her nephew. It was a lie, but it felt like a necessary one. Mr. Davidson was reluctant, but eventually agreed to let me in, provided he accompanied me. Helena's apartment was exactly as I'd expected, meticulously clean, with old-fashioned furniture and lace doilies on every surface. But it felt wrong somehow, like a museum display of a life, rather than a place where someone had actually lived. The air was stale and cold, and there was an underlying scent of decay that the cleaning crew had been unable to eliminate. We found the box exactly where the note had indicated, tucked behind the radiator in the bedroom. It was a small wooden jewelry box, carved with intricate flowers and birds. Inside were dozens of letters, some in envelopes, others loose, all written in different handwritings, but addressing the same person, Alina. The letters spanned decades, from the 1960s through the 1980s. They were love letters, family correspondence, and personal notes, all addressed to Alina Vargas, or Alina Varga, or Alina Vergarda. Names seemed to shift slightly in different documents. As I read through them, a picture began to emerge of a woman who had lived many lives, who had reinvented herself repeatedly, always moving, always changing, always running from something. The last letter was different. It was addressed to Helena, and dated just a month before her death. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. "My dear Helena," it began, "I know you think you've finally found peace, but the rain remembers. It always remembers. You can change your name, your hair, your address, but you cannot change what you've done. Alina is still here, waiting in the rain, and she wants her life back." Mr. Davidson had been reading over my shoulder, and I felt him tense as we reached the end of the letter. "This is very strange," he murmured. "Who would send such a thing to an elderly woman?" But I was beginning to understand. Helena hadn't just been my neighbor, she'd been Alina too, and possibly others before that. She'd been running from something, or someone, for decades. And now, in death, her past had finally caught up with her. That night, the tapping against the wall was more insistent than ever. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like Morse code. I pressed my ear to the wall that separated our apartments and listened carefully. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 tap. Over and over, the same pattern. I spent hours online researching Morse code patterns, and finally found the translation. SOS, she was calling for help. The next note appeared despite the fact that there had been no rain. "Sarah, you found the letters. You know who I really am now. Alina wants me to give her life back, but I don't know how. She whispers to me through the rain, tells me about all the years I stole from her. But I don't remember being Alina. I only remember being Helena, and before that, darkness." I began to piece together what I believed had happened. Alina Vargas had disappeared in 1987, but she hadn't gone willingly. Something had taken her place, something that had borrowed her face, her life, her identity. That something had become Helena Varga, living a quiet, careful existence, while the real Alina remained trapped somewhere in between, calling out through rain and tapping in the spaces between heartbeats. The notes became more desperate. "She's getting stronger, Sarah. When it rains now, I can see her in the puddles, reaching up from underneath. She looks just like I did when I was young, but her eyes are full of water and sorrow. She wants her apartment back. She wants her life back. She wants her name back." I started researching the building's history, looking for any connection to the supernatural or unexplained. What I found was a pattern of tenants in apartment 4A who had lived unusually long lives, often well into their 90s, before dying, peacefully in their sleep. But many of these tenants had no documented history before moving into the building. As if their lives had begun the day they signed their lease. The building had been constructed in 1952 on the site of a boarding house that had burned down during a terrible storm. 7 people had died in that fire, including a young woman named Alina Varga, who had been visiting from out of town. The parallels were too striking to ignore. On December 23rd, during the heaviest rainstorm I'd experienced since moving to the building, I found the final note. The paper was completely soaked, disintegrating in my hands as I tried to read it. The words were barely visible. Tonight, when the rain is loudest, leave your door unlocked. Let Alina come home. Let me finally rest. I spent the evening pacing my apartment, torn between rational skepticism and a growing sense that something monumental was about to happen. The rain was indeed loud, drumming against the windows with unusual intensity, and underneath it, I could hear the tapping from next door, not the usual rhythmic pattern, but frantic, desperate knocking. At midnight, I made my decision. I unlocked my door and left it slightly ajar, then sat in my living room chair facing the hallway. I don't know what I expected to see, but I knew I needed to witness whatever was about to happen. The sounds from the hallway grew louder: footsteps, whispered voices, the sound of a door opening and closing. I heard what might have been crying, or laughing, or both. The temperature in my apartment dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath, and the lights began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. Through my partially open door, I saw a figure moving in the hallway. At first, it looked like Helenov, the same careful posture, the same silver hair. But as I watched, the figure seemed to shift and change, becoming younger, her hair darkening, her clothes transforming from Helena's conservative dresses to something more contemporary, more alive. The figure paused in front of Helena's door, and I heard a key turning in the lock. The door opened, and warm light spilled out into the hallway, though I knew the apartment had been dark and empty for months. The figure stepped inside, and just before the door closed, she turned to look directly at me. It wasn't Helena's face I saw, but it wasn't entirely Elena's either. It was something new, something that contained both women but was neither of them. She smiled, and in that smile, I saw gratitude, relief, and a kind of peace I'd never witnessed before. The door closed with a soft click, and the hallway returned to normal. The lights stopped flickering, the temperature gradually returned to normal, and the frantic tapping from next door fell silent. For the first time in months, the building felt truly quiet. I never found another note outside my door. The apartment next to mine remained officially empty, but sometimes, on particularly rainy nights, I hear the soft sounds of someone living, water running, footsteps across hardwood floors, the faint sound of humming. These sounds don't frighten me anymore. They seem happy, content, like the sounds of someone who has finally come home after a very long journey. Mr. Davidson mentioned once that he'd been having trouble renting an apartment for a prospective tenants, would tour the space and express interest, but something always made them change their minds. It's the strangest thing, he told me. They say it feels like someone's already living there, even though it's completely empty. I smile when he says things like this, but I don't tell him what I know. Some stories are too delicate to share, too precious to risk having them dismissed or explained away. Besides, Eleni, I'm convinced that's who she is, now has earned her privacy. She waited decades to reclaim her life, her name, her home. The least I can do is let her live it in peace. Sometimes, on the rainiest nights, I leave small gifts outside her door: a cup of tea that's always gone by morning, a book of poetry, fresh flowers from the market. I never see her take them, but they always disappear, and occasionally, I find a small thank you note in that familiar handwriting, signed simply, E. The rain is still falling as I finish telling you this story. Listen to it now. Really listen. Can you hear the secrets it carries? Can you hear the voices of all the souls who have waited in the spaces between raindrops, hoping someone would remember their names? Alina found her peace by giving Alina back her life, but there are others out there, still waiting, still hoping, still leaving notes that most people dismiss as pranks or imagination. So the next time you find an unexpected note, the next time You hear unexplained sounds in the rain. Don't be so quick to find a rational explanation. Sometimes the most impossible stories are the truest ones of all. Sometimes the dead have messages for the living, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get to help deliver them home. Now close your eyes and let the rain sing you to sleep. Let it carry away your worries and fears, but let it also remind you that every drop has a story, every storm has a secret, and every rainy night is a chance for something magical to happen. Sweet dreams, and remember, if you ever find a note outside your door, read it carefully. You might be the only one who can help someone find their way home. *** every night at 3:17. The elevator opens by itself, ***, as the rain falls softly outside, creating a soothing symphony against the windows. I invite you to settle in, to find a comfortable position where you can allow the day to slip away. Let the gentle rhythm of the droplets wash over you, and breathe deeply, inhaling the scent of fresh earth mingled with the coolness of the storm. This is not just another night. It is a moment of calm before the unknown unfurls its tendrils. Close your eyes and let the darkness cradle you. In this space, we will drift together into a story, a whisper of mystery that teeters on the edge of the ordinary and the bizarre. I will share with you the tale of an experience that began like any other, but soon spiraled into something far more unsettling. So relax, dear listener, and let the rain be your companion as we delve into the shadows. I live in a small, aging apartment building that leans heavily into the past, both in its architecture and in the stories that echo through its halls. The walls are painted a faded yellow, chipped and peeling in places, revealing the layers of history beneath. Each apartment is a small world, a collection of lives intertwined, yet distinctly separate. My neighbors are a mix of young professionals, retirees, and a few families, all of us bound by the creaking floors and the hauntingly familiar smells of mildew and old wood. There is something comforting about the routine of life here. The scent of coffee wafting through the hallway in the mornings, the muffled laughter of children playing in the courtyard, and the soft murmurs of conversations drifting from behind closed doors. Yet, beneath this veneer of normalcy, there lingers a peculiar undercurrent, a sense that the building itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was a Tuesday evening when I first noticed it. The rain was falling, as it often does, a gentle patter that filled the air with a sense of calm. I had just returned from a long day at work, my mind still buzzing with thoughts of deadlines and meetings. As I stepped off the elevator, I caught a whiff of something strange, a faint, floral perfume that seemed out of place in the stale air of the building. It was a scent I recognized, but I couldn't quite place it. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the remnants of my day, and made my way to my apartment. As I settled into my routine, the aroma lingered in the back of my mind, but I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination. After all, the mind can play tricks, especially when one is tired. I poured myself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting gentle shadows around the room. Outside, the rain continued its rhythmic dance, a reminder that the world outside was both familiar and distant. The following night, however, was different. As I prepared for bed, I heard a soft ding from the elevator. My heart skipped a beat. It was too late for anyone to be coming home. I glanced at the clock. It was precisely 3:17 a.m. The sound echoed through the silence, reverberating against the walls, sending a shiver down my spine. I brushed it off as the wind, or perhaps a figment of my imagination once more. Yet an unsettling feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, listening to the rain and the occasional creaks of the building settling. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, the soft ding of the elevator, followed by a faint rustle, like someone stepping out into the emptiness of the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. After a moment of hesitation, I finally mustered the courage to peek through my peephole. The hallway was empty, drenched in the dim light of the flickering bulb above. The elevator doors stood ajar, yet no one was there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a stark contrast to the quiet stillness around me. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps it was a neighbor returning home late, or maybe someone had mistakenly pressed the button. I shook my head, trying to rationalize the situation. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me, I thought, as I retreated back into the safety of my apartment. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. Each night at 3:17 a.m., the elevator would open by itself, the soft ding echoing through the hall. I began to notice other peculiarities. 2 strange notes slipped under my door, written in a hurried scrawl, urging me to stay away or don't trust the shadows. The scent of that floral perfume became more pronounced, a ghostly reminder of something I couldn't quite grasp. Despite my growing unease, I found myself drawn to the mystery. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything: the notes, the scent, the times the elevator opened. I would sit by my window, rain tapping against the glass, and ponder the stories hidden within the walls. I spoke to a few neighbors, but they seemed oblivious to the happenings. "You're imagining things," one said with a dismissive wave, her voice laced with fatigue. "It's an old building. Things creak and groan." But I knew it was more than that. The notes grew more disturbing, filled with warnings that spiraled into nonsensical phrases. "She is coming for you, and the darkness breathes at 3:17. I felt as if I were teetering on the brink of something vast and unknowable, and I was no longer certain of my own sanity. The rain outside seemed to amplify my confusion, each drop a whisper, urging me to look closer, to delve deeper into the shadows that nested within the building. Then one night, when the rain poured in heavy sheets against the windows, I decided I could no longer ignore what was happening. The air was thick with tension, and the scent of the floral perfume had started to seep into my dreams, haunting me with glimpses of a figure cloaked in shadows, always just out of reach. I resolved to confront whatever lay hidden within the elevator. I waited, heart racing, as the hour approached. The clock ticked steadily, marking each passing moment. My apartment felt like a cage, the walls closing in around me as I sat on the edge of my bed, listening intently. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the familiar ding echoed through the hallway, resonating like a bell tolling in the darkness. I stood, legs trembling, and made my way to the door. As I opened it, the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit and eerily silent. I stepped out, the old floorboards creaking beneath my weight, and approached the elevator. The door stood slightly ajar, as if beckoning me to step inside. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the doors open wider and stepped into the metallic enclosure. Inside, the air felt charged, thick with an energy I couldn't explain. I pressed the button for the ground floor, and the door slid shut with a soft hiss. The elevator lurched to life, descending slowly as I gripped the railing, my heart pounding in rhythm with the steady hum of the machinery. I felt a chill creep down my spine, the temperature dropping suddenly, and the scent of that floral perfume enveloped me, overwhelming and intoxicating. As the elevator descended, I heard whispers, faint and indistinct, swirling around me like a ghostly breeze. I strained to catch the words, but they slipped away like smoke, leaving behind only a feeling of dread. My mind raced, questioning what I was doing, why I had chosen to confront the unknown. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to the ground floor, revealing the darkened lobby. I hesitated, a sense of foreboding settling over me. The lobby was empty, save for the flickering light overhead casting eerie shadows. I stepped out, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I turned to head towards the main entrance, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, flicker of movement near the staircase. I felt an inexplicable pull to investigate, my curiosity outweighing my fear. I approached cautiously, every nerve ending taut with apprehension. The air around me grew colder, and the whispers intensified, wrapping around me like a shroud. I reached the base of the stairs and peered up into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the empty stairwell stretching upward, shadowy and foreboding. I turned to leave, but then I heard a soft, melodic voice calling my name, laced with a desperate familiarity. "Help me," it pleaded, echoing softly against the walls. I froze, my heart racing. The voice was unmistakably it. Was the same voice that had haunted my dreams, the one I had tried so hard to forget. I stepped back, stumbling slightly, and felt a sudden rush of cold air wash over me. The whispers morphed into a cacophony, a chorus of voices urging me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, trapped between fear and an overwhelming need to uncover the truth. "Help me, please," the voice repeated, more insistent now, drawing me closer. I felt the shadows flicker around me, shifting and swirling, and I knew I had to confront this apparition, this remnant of whatever had been trapped within the building. I took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness of the stairwell, my heart pounding in my chest. As I climbed the stairs, the temperature dropped further, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. I reached the landing and paused, glancing back down at the lobby below, a sense of dread washing over me. The shadows seemed to dance, flickering in and out of existence, and I felt as if I were being watched. "Don't be afraid," the voice soothed, now sounding closer. "I'm here." I rounded the corner, and there it was, a figure shrouded in darkness, standing at the end of the corridor, half hidden in the shadows. I could feel my heart racing. It was as if time had frozen around me. The figure was indistinct, but I could make out the faint outline of a woman, her features obscured by the darkness. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, thick with apprehension. "I'm trapped," she replied, her voice fragile and haunting. "I've been waiting for someone to help me." "What do you mean?" My voice trembled as I spoke. "How can I help you?" "I cannot leave this place," she explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am bound by the rules of this building, forgotten by time. You must remember me." A jolt of recognition hit me, a memory flickering just beyond my reach. I stepped closer, drawn in by her sorrowful gaze. "I don't understand," I admitted. "What do you want from me?" "Remember," she urged, her voice breaking. "The rain is our connection. It is what keeps us apart and what binds us together. You must find the truth hidden in the shadows." As she spoke, I felt a rush of memories flood through me, flashes of laughter, whispers of secrets shared, and the scent of that floral perfume. It was then I realized she was someone I had loved, someone I had lost. The pieces began to fall into place, and I understood that the building itself was a prison, holding on to the souls of those who had once lived and loved within its walls. The rain fell heavier outside, tapping against the windows like fingers, searching for a way in. "I will help you," I promised, my resolve hardening. "But how?" "Find the mirror," she whispered urgently. "It's hidden in the old laundry room. It holds the answers." Before I could respond, she faded into the shadows, leaving behind a lingering chill and the echo of her voice. The corridor felt emptier now, as if the very air had shifted. I turned and hurried down the stairs, propelled by a sense of urgency. I had to uncover the truth, to free her soul from the clutches of this place. As I reached the ground floor, I felt the weight of the building pressing down on me, the shadows curling around my ankles like tendrils. I made my way to the laundry room, pushing open the heavy door that creaked in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the dim light flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the room. Amidst the old washing machines and forgotten piles of clothes, I spotted a large, ornate mirror, its surface clouded and dusty. I approached it cautiously, drawn in by the allure of its reflective surface. As I wiped away the grime with my sleeve, my heart raced at the prospect of uncovering the secrets within. I stared into the mirror, and for a moment, I saw nothing but my own reflection. But then, slowly, the image began to shift. The glass rippled, like water, distorting my features until they faded, revealing scenes from the past, a glimpse of laughter, a celebration, and then, a moment of despair. I saw Hearth, a woman from the shadows, her eyes filled with longing and sorrow. "Remember," she urged, her voice echoing through the room, filled with desperation. "You must remember." I closed my eyes, focusing on the memories flooding back. I saw her face clearly now, a sense of familiarity washing over me. We had shared dreams, hopes, and fears. I had lost her to the darkness, to a world that had forgotten us both. The weight of realization settled heavily on my chest. As the images faded, the mirror began to ripple again, and I felt a pull, a connection that linked us across time and space. I reached out, my fingertips grazing the surface, and suddenly, the world around me shifted. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp, and I felt a surge of energy coursing through me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody in the darkness. "You are the key." With a sudden rush of clarity, I understood what I had to do. I closed my eyes and focused, channeling my energy into the mirror, willing it to reveal the truth. The surface shimmered, and I felt a warmth envelop me, as if the very essence of the building was responding to my call. The rain outside intensified, a torrential downpour that rattled the windows, and in that moment, I felt the connection solidify. The boundaries between our worlds began to blur, and I could hear her voice clearer than ever, guiding me through the darkness. "Let go of the pain," she urged. "Release me." As I opened my eyes, the mirror flashed with light, illuminating the room in a warm glow. The shadows receded, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, as if the very essence of the building was releasing its hold. With a final surge of energy, I focused all my thoughts and emotions, and in that moment, the mirror shattered, glass splintered, and flew through the air. But as it did, I felt a rush of freedom envelop me. The darkness that had clung to me began to dissipate, and I heard her voice one last time, filled with gratitude and peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her image fading into the light dot as the echoes of the past faded. I found myself standing in the empty laundry room, the shadows retreating into the corners. The scent of the floral perfume lingered, but now it felt lighter, infused with a sense of hope. I had freed her soul, but at what cost? The rain outside continued to fall, a soothing backdrop to the chaos of my thoughts. I stepped back into the hallway, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. The air was different now, lighter somehow, as if the building itself had exhaled a long-held breath. But, as I made my way back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me. The experience had left a mark, a reminder of the fragility of life and the ties that bind us to those we have lost. The elevator doors slid shut behind me, and as I pressed the button for my floor, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw her, standing at the end of the hallway, a soft smile gracing her lips before she melted back into the shadows. I turned away, my heart heavy, yet somehow lighter, and stepped into the elevator, embracing the calm that enveloped me. As the doors closed, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the building shift, as if it had finally found peace. The rain continued to fall, a soothing reminder of the connection we shared, a veil between dimensions, a bridge between lives. I let out a soft sigh, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders. The echoes of the past still whispered in my mind, but now they held a different meaning. I had faced the darkness and emerged on the other side, forever changed, yet grateful for the glimpse into the unknown as I lay down in bed that night. the rain drumming softly against the window. I closed my eyes and allowed the memories to wash over me. Though questions remained unanswered, I found solace in the knowledge that love endures, even in the shadows. And as I drifted into sleep, I could almost hear her voice, a soft whisper carried on the wind, reminding me that we are never truly alone. In the end, dear listener, remember that the rain may veil the world in mystery, but it also has a way of washing away the past, allowing us to find peace in the present. Close your eyes, let the rain sing you to sleep, and know that the shadows may hold secrets, but they also carry the whispers of those we have loved. My daughters, imaginary friend lives in the mirror. Close your eyes and listen to the rain tapping against your window. Let it wash over you like a gentle lullaby, each droplet carrying away the weight of the day. Tonight, I want to share something with you, something that happened in my own home. In the quiet hours when children whisper secrets to shadows and parents pretend not to hear, pull your blankets closer, settle into the darkness, and let me tell you about my daughter Emma and the friend she found in our hallway mirror. The rain outside sounds just like it did that autumn when everything changed, when I learned that some reflections don't always show what stands before them. The mirror had been in our house when we moved in 3 years ago. It was one of those old-fashioned pieces with an ornate silver frame hanging in the narrow hallway between Emma's bedroom and mine. The previous owners had left it behind, along with a few other odds and ends, a castor and doorstop shaped like a cat, some yellowed curtains in the basement, and that mirror. My ex-wife Sarah had always meant to replace it. Said it looked too old-fashioned for our taste, but life got busy, then complicated, and eventually she left, taking most of our newer furniture, but somehow forgetting about the mirror entirely. Emma was for when Sarah moved out, old enough to notice the empty spaces in our house, but young enough to fill them with imagination. I did my best as a single father, maintaining routines, keeping bedtimes sacred, reading stories with different voices for each character. But children have a way of finding companionship in the strangest places, and Emma found hers in that hallway mirror. It started innocently enough. I'd catch her standing in front of it, having animated conversations with her reflection. At first, I assumed she was just practicing expressions or playing dress-up games. Then I noticed she was having actual dialogue, speaking, then pausing, as if listening, then responding. The pauses were what caught my attention. They were too precise, too timed, as if someone was actually answering her. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" I asked one evening, as I found her there, still in her pink pajamas, her small hands pressed against the glass. "My friend," she said, without turning around. "She lives in the mirror house." "What's her name?" "Emma," she said, which made sense. Children often played with imaginary versions of themselves. "And what do you two talk about?" She finally turned to look at me, her dark eyes serious in a way that seemed too old for her face. "She tells me about the other house, the one that looks like ours but everything is backwards." I smiled and ruffled her hair. "That sounds interesting, but it's time for bed now." That night, as I tucked her in, she asked, "Daddy, why doesn't Mira Emma have a daddy?" "What do you mean?" "She says there's no daddy in the mirror house. Just her and Mira Mommy. But Mira Mommy is always sleeping." A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't say why. "It's just pretend, Emma. Imaginary friends don't have real families." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't quite believe me. "Mira Emma says her mommy has been sleeping for a very long time." I changed the subject, read her favorite book about a brave little mouse, and kissed her goodnight. But as I walked past the mirror, on my way to my own room, I found myself pausing, staring at my reflection. Just my own face, looking back, tired and concerned, with the hallway light casting familiar shadows behind me. Over the next few weeks, Emma's conversations with Mirror Emma became a daily occurrence. She would stand at the mirror every morning before breakfast, whispering secrets I couldn't quite catch. Sometimes I'd hear her giggling, other times her voice would take on a serious, almost worried tone. When I asked what they talked about, she'd give me vague answers about games and stories, about the backwards world, where everything was almost the same, but slightly wrong. Mira Emma says the books in her house have different pictures, she told me one rainy Tuesday, and the clocks run backwards. That sounds silly, I said, trying to keep my voice light. She's not silly, Daddy. She's scared. Scared of what? Emma's face grew solemn. Of the sleeping mummy. She says Mira mummy sleeps with her eyes open, and sometimes she moves but doesn't wake up. That evening, after Emma was asleep, I stood in front of the mirror myself, studying it closely. The silver frame was tarnished in places, and the glass had that slight warp that old mirrors develop over time. When I moved, my reflection moved with me perfectly, naturally. When I raised my hand, so did the man in the glass. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. But as I turned to leave, something made me look back. Just for a moment, I could have sworn my reflection had been a half-second slow to turn away. The conversations with Mira Emma continued through October and into November. I began to notice patterns in Emma's behavior. She would rush to the mirror as soon as she woke up, as if checking on someone. She'd linger there after dinner, sometimes placing her palm flat against the glass and holding it there for long minutes. Most troubling, she started having nightmares. Mirror Emma is scared, she told me one morning, her eyes red from crying. The sleeping mommy moved last night. She sat up in bed, but her eyes stayed closed. It was just a dream, sweetheart. No, Daddy, Mira Emma told me. She hides when the sleeping mommy moves. She doesn't want her to wake up. I made an appointment with Emma's pediatrician, worried that the stress of her mother's absence was manifesting in increasingly elaborate fantasies. Dr. Martinez listened patiently as I described Emma's imaginary friend, nodded knowingly, and assured me that complex imaginary relationships were normal for children dealing with parental separation. It's her way of processing the loss, she explained. The mirror friend represents her desire to have her mother back, but the sleeping mommy suggests she understands, on some level, that her mother isn't coming home. It's actually quite sophisticated emotional work for a 4-year-old. I felt somewhat relieved, but that relief was short-lived. That very night, I woke to the sound of Emma's voice in the hallway. The digital clock beside my bed read 2:47 a.m. I slipped out of bed and crept to my doorway. Emma stood before the mirror, in her white nightgown, her small hand pressed against the glass. She was whispering urgently, and in the dim light filtering from her nightlight, I could see her reflection whispering back. But there was something wrong with the timing. Emma would speak, then her reflection would respond, and then Emma would listen to a response that seemed to come a beat too late. Mirror Emma, don't go, I heard her whisper. Please don't leave me alone. I was about to step forward when I heard something that made my blood freeze. A faint voice, barely audible, seemed to come from the mirror itself, not Emma's voice. Not quite, but similar. Younger maybe, or more distant. She's waking up, the voice whispered. The sleeping mommy is waking up, and she's looking for me. Emma pressed both hands against the glass now, and I swear I saw another pair of hands press back from the other side. Slightly smaller than Emma's, positioned as if reaching through from behind the surface. Hide with me, Emma whispered. Come, to this side where it's safe. I can't, came the reply, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. She won't let me leave. She wants me to sleep too. I stepped forward, and the floorboard creaked. Emma spun around, her face pale and frightened. Daddy, you scared Mirror Emma away. I knelt beside her, my heart racing. Emma, it's the middle of the night. You should be in bed. But Mirror Emma needed help. The sleeping mommy is trying to wake up, and Mirror Emma is scared. I glanced at the mirror. Only my own reflection, and Emma's looked back. Perfectly normal, perfectly timed. Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you back to bed. As I tucked her in, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Daddy, what if Mirror Emma gets caught by the sleeping mommy? It's just pretend, Emma. Mirror Emma isn't real. She stared at me with those two old eyes. Then why did you hear her talking too? I had no answer for that. The next day, I called my sister Janet, who had always been more intuitive about these things than I was. I told her about Emma's imaginary friend, about the conversations, about what I thought I'd heard in the hallway. Mirrors can be tricky things, she said in that matter-of-fact way she had, especially old ones. They hold on to things. You sound like you believe Emma's friend is real. I believe Emma believes she's real, and sometimes, in old houses, with old mirrors, the line between belief and reality gets a little blurred. That's not very comforting, Janet. Maybe you should try talking to her yourself. To Mirror Emma, I mean. You're joking. Am I? Emma's not the first child to find a friend in a mirror, and she won't be the last. If it is just imagination, no harm done. If it's something more, ... double quotes, she paused. Well, at least you'll know what you're dealing with. That evening, after Emma was asleep, I found myself standing in front of the hallway mirror. I felt foolish, but I spoke to my reflection in a whisper. Are you there? Mirror Emma, Mirror Emma. Nothing, just my own tired face looking back at me. I tried again. Emma says you're scared. Are you okay? For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so gradually, I almost missed it. My reflection seemed to shift. Not moving exactly, but the expression changed, baked younger, more frightened. The eyes that looked back at me weren't quite my own anymore. She won't stop sleeping, came a voice so faint it might have been the wind. But she moves in her sleep. She's looking for me. My reflection's mouth hadn't moved, but I'd heard the words clearly. My hands were shaking as I leaned closer to the glass. Who won't stop sleeping? The mommy. My mommy. She's been sleeping so long, but her eyes are open now, and she keeps getting up to look for me. I have to hide. Where do you hide in the mirror house? But she's learning how to look here too. She stands where you're standing and stares in, and I have to be very quiet so she doesn't see me. The face in the mirror was definitely not my own now. It was a child's face, Emma's face, but somehow differentiated, more the reflection of a child who had been afraid for a very long time. When did she start sleeping? I asked. After Daddy went away. She went to bed and never got up, except to look for me. But she sleeps with her eyes open now, and when she walks, she doesn't make sounds. She just drifts around the house, looking, always looking. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. What happened to your daddy? He left. Just like your Emma's daddy left. But our daddy never came back. I didn't leave Emma, I said, confused. I'm Emma's daddy. The face in the mirror tilted its head, studying me with ancient sadness. Not my Emma. I'm Mirror Emma. My daddy left long ago, before the sleeping started. My mommy has been sleeping for, I don't know how long. Time moves different here. I stared at this impossible conversation. This child who couldn't exist speaking words that shouldn't be possible. How long have you been in there? Always. Since the sleeping started. Since mommy couldn't wake up but couldn't stop looking for me. I've been hiding in the mirror house, watching the backwards world, talking to the other Emma when she comes to visit. The other Emma, ... that's my daughter. She's kind to me. She listens when I'm scared. She doesn't think I'm pretend. My throat felt tight. What do you want? The child in the mirror, this Mirror Emma, who wore my daughter's face but carried decades of loneliness, pressed her small hand against the glass from her side. I want the sleeping to stop. I want mommy to really wake up or really sleep. I want to not be afraid anymore. How can I help you? I don't know, but your Emma thinks you can fix things. She talks about how you read her stories and make the monsters go away. She says you're brave. I placed my hand against the glass, mirroring the child's gesture. The surface was cold, but for just a moment, I could swear I felt warmth on the other side, the touch of a small palm that needed comfort. I'll try, I whispered, but I need to understand. Where is your house? Your real house? It's here, she said. It's always been here. The same rooms, the same walls, but backwards. Everything is backwards in the mirror house, except the fear. The fear is exactly the same. Over the following nights, I continued these impossible conversations. Mirror Emma told me about her world, a reflection of our house, where everything was reversed, where clocks ran backwards and books read from right to left, where a woman who had once been a mother now drifted through empty rooms in an endless, restless sleep. She described how this sleeping mother would stand in doorways, eyes open but unseeing, searching for a daughter who stayed hidden in mirrors and reflections. Emmy began to notice my late-night visits to the mirror. You're talking to her too now, she said one morning over breakfast. Mirror Emma told me. Yes, I admitted. She's scared, and I wanted to help. She likes you. She says you have kind eyes, like a real daddy should have. What else does she tell you? Emma stirred her cereal thoughtfully. She says the sleeping mommy is getting stronger. She can stay awake longer now, and she's learning how to look in mirrors. Mirror Emma has to hide deeper and deeper in the glass. What does that mean? There are layers in the mirror world, like rooms behind rooms. But the deeper you go, the harder it is to find your way back. That night, when I approached the mirror, Mirror Emma's face appeared almost immediately. But it was fainter than before, as if she was speaking from very far away. She almost found me today, she whispered. The sleeping mommy stood right where you are now, and looked into the mirror for a long time. I had to go to the deep place, the place where the light doesn't reach. Can you get back out? I think so. But each time I go deeper, it's harder to remember the way. And I can hear her in there with me sometimes, walking through the deep mirrors, calling my name. What's your real name? I asked suddenly. There was a long pause. I don't remember. I've been Mirror Emma for so long. Your Emma calls me that, and I like having a name that someone uses with love. My heart broke for this lost child, this fragment of a tragedy I didn't fully understand. Would you like me to give you a name? Yes, she said, and for the first time, I saw her smile, shy, grateful expression that transformed her face. What name would you choose? I thought of Sarah, who had left us, but whom I had loved once. I thought of second chances and new beginnings. How about Hope? Hope, she repeated, and the name seemed to bring light to her faded features. I like that. It's a name for someone who believes things can get better. Things can get better. Hope. I promise, we'll find a way. But even as I said it, her image was growing fainter. I have to hide again. She's coming. She's learned to look for me in the talking place. Wait, but she was gone, and I was left staring at my own reflection. Once more. The next few days were tense. Emma reported that Mirror Emma Hope was harder to reach, that their conversations were shorter and more hurried. My own attempts to contact her yielded only brief glimpses, shadowy movements in the depths of the mirror that might have been a frightened child or might have been tricks of light. Then came the night when everything changed. I woke to Emma screaming, not the cry of a nightmare, but genuine terror. I ran to her room and found her bed empty, her window closed, her nightlight casting long shadows across the walls. The screaming was coming from the hallway. Emma stood before the mirror in her nightgown, but she was pressed against the opposite wall, as far from the glass as she could get, while still facing it. Her screams had turned to whimpers, and she was pointing at the mirror with a shaking hand. Daddy, look at the mirror. I looked, and my blood turned to ice. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. Instead of showing our hallway, it revealed a different space, the same hallway, but older, shabbier, with peeling wallpaper and dim lighting. And in that reflected hallway stood a woman. She wore a faded nightgown that might once have been white, and her long hair hung loose around her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, facing the mirror from her side, and her eyes were open wide, staring, unblinking. But those eyes held no awareness, no life. They were the eyes of someone caught between sleep and death, and they were searching. As I watched, frozen with terror, the woman took a step forward, then another. She was walking toward the mirror from her side, and with each step, she seemed to become more solid, more present in our world. She found me, came Hope's voice, faint and terrified, seeming to echo from deep within the glass. The sleeping mommy found me, and now she wants to come through. She wants to take me back to the deep sleep. The woman in the mirror was close to the glass now, her pale hands reaching forward, where her palms touched the surface from her side. The mirror began to ripple like water. "Emma, get back," I shouted to my daughter, but she was already pressed against the far wall. I didn't think, I simply acted. I stepped forward and placed my hands against the mirror, matching the position of the sleeping woman's hands. The glass was cold beyond belief, so cold it burned, and I could feel something trying to push through from the other side. "Hope," I called. "Hope, where are you?" "I'm here," came her voice, very faint, but she's holding on to me. She won't let me hide anymore. The woman in the mirror tilted her head, and for a moment her blank eyes seemed to focus on me. Her mouth opened, and a sound emerged, not quite a voice, not quite a moan, but something that spoke of endless, restless sleep and the hunger for what was lost. "Let her go," I said to the sleeping woman. "She doesn't belong to you anymore." The woman's grip on the glass tightened, and cracks began to spider across the mirror's surface. But I held on, pressing back with all my strength. "Hope," I called. "Again, you don't have to go back to sleep. You can choose to wake up, really wake up." "I'm scared," came her voice. "I know, but you have a name now. You have people who care about you. You're not alone in the dark anymore." The sleeping woman let out another of those terrible sounds, and the mirror cracked further. But in the spaces between the cracks, I saw Hope's face, not hiding in the depths anymore, but right at the surface, pressing her small hands against the glass from her side. "I want to wake up," she whispered. "Then wake up," I said. "Choose life. Choose light. Choose to step out of the sleep." The sleeping woman suddenly convulsed, her back arching, her mouth opening in a silent scream. And then, like a bubble bursting, she simply ... ended. Not disappeared, not faded, but ended, as if she had never been anything more than a dream that someone had finally decided to abandon. The mirror went still. The cracks remained, but the surface was solid again, reflecting only our own hallway. And there, in the center of those spider-webbed reflections, stood Hope, not as Mira Emma anymore, but as herself, smiling with the joy of someone who has remembered what it means to be awake. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was clear now, no longer echoing from deep places. "Thank you for giving me a name, for helping me remember that sleeping isn't the only choice." "What will you do now?" I asked. "I think I'll go find where I really belong," she said. "Not in the mirror house, not in the backwards world, but somewhere new. Somewhere where children don't have to hide from sleeping mothers, and where daddies don't leave, and where hope isn't just a name someone gives you, but something you carry inside." She pressed her hand against the glass one more time, and I pressed mine against it from my side. For just a moment, I felt the warm touch of a child who had found her way home to herself. "Will we see you again?" Emma asked, stepping closer now that the sleeping woman was gone. "Maybe," Hope said with a smile. "But if you do, I won't be hiding anymore. I'll be playing in the sunshine, where mirrors show exactly what's there. Nothing more and nothing less." and then she was gone, not fading, not hiding, but walking away from the mirror as if she had somewhere important to be. The mirror hangs in our hallway still, though the cracks never quite healed. Sometimes, on rainy nights like this one, I catch Emma looking into it with a thoughtful expression, but she's not talking to imaginary friends anymore. She's just checking her reflection, making sure her hair's brushed, seeing herself as she truly is. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the light hits the cracked glass just right, I swear I see a flicker of movement, not trapped, not hiding, but free. A child playing somewhere beyond the mirror, in a place where sleep is restful and dreams are kind, and where mothers wake up when their children need them. The rain is still falling outside your window, washing the world clean, carrying away the old hurts and making space for new growth. Close your eyes now and rest easy. Know that sometimes the things we fear in mirrors aren't malevolent spirits or dark reflections of ourselves. Sometimes they're just lost children who need someone to help them remember their own names. To choose wakefulness over endless sleep, to step out of the backwards world and into the light. Sweet dreams, and may your own reflections show you exactly who you are, no more, no less, and always worthy of love. Close your eyes and listen to the rain falling against your window. Feel how it sounds different tonight, heavier, more insistent, like it's trying to tell you something important. I need to share what happened to me last month, something that changed how I hear rainfall, forever. Let your breathing slow, let the sound of the water wash over you, and listen carefully, because some storms carry more than just weather, and some graves refuse to stay quiet when the ground gets soft enough. I moved to Millbrook in early October, drawn by the promise of a fresh start and a house I could actually afford. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Linda, had been almost apologetic about the price. It's been on the market for 8 months, she explained as we walked through the small colonial. The previous owner passed away, and his family just wants to sell quickly. The house was perfect for what I needed: 2 bedrooms, a small office where I could work remotely, and a backyard large enough for the garden I'd been dreaming about. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with mature oak trees, and the kind of houses that spoke of decades of careful maintenance. My nearest neighbor was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who waved from her kitchen window as Linda showed me around the property. The only thing, Linda said, hesitating as we stood in the backyard, is that there's an old family plot back there. She pointed to the far corner of the yard, where a wrought iron fence enclosed a small area beneath a massive oak tree. 3 graves, dating back to the 1890s. The Hartwell family. They built this house originally. I walked over to examine the plot. The fence was well maintained, painted black with decorative flourishes that spoke of Victorian sensibilities. Inside, 3 weathered headstones stood in a neat row. 2 were clearly very old, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of weather, but the third looked newer, its granite surface still sharp and readable. Marcus Hartwell, 1952 to 2023, beloved son and last of his line. The man who just passed, I asked. Linda nodded. Marcus was the great-great-grandson of the original owners. Never married, no children. He spent his whole life in this house, taking care of the family plot. The neighbors say he was ... eccentric, very private, but harmless. The price was too good to pass up, and honestly, the idea of having a small family cemetery in my backyard felt more intriguing than disturbing. I'd always been drawn to history, to the stories that old places carry. I signed the papers that afternoon. I moved in on a Thursday, spending the weekend unpacking and getting settled. The house had good bones, as they say, with hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot and windows that let in generous amounts of autumn light. Marcus had left it in excellent condition, though his decorating sense was decidedly old-fashioned. Dark wood furniture, heavy curtains, and an impressive collection of books about local history and genealogy. It was Mrs. Chen who first mentioned the rain. I was outside on Sunday morning, raking leaves, when she appeared at the fence that separated our properties. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're settling in well," she said, watching me work. "I'm glad someone's finally living here again. The house was lonely." "It's a beautiful place," I replied, pausing to wipe sweat from my forehead. "I'm still getting used to having a cemetery in the backyard, but it's kind of fascinating." Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. "You should know about the rain," she said quietly. "The rain. It hits harder over there." She nodded toward the family plot. "Always has, for as long as I've lived here. 23 years now. Even in the lightest drizzle, it sounds like a downpour over Marcus's grave." I looked back at the cemetery, where the oak tree's remaining leaves rustled in the mild breeze. "That's probably just the tree," I said. "Big canopy like that, it would collect and concentrate the rainfall." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Not the tree, just Marcus. The other two graves, they get wet like everything else. But his ... double quotes," she trailed off, then seemed to shake herself. "Well, you'll see for yourself soon enough. Weather report says we're getting a storm tonight." She was right about the storm. I woke around 2 in the morning to the sound of rain against my bedroom window, a steady patter that should have been soothing. But there was something else, something that made me sit up in bed and listen more carefully. From somewhere in the house came a different sound, a harder, more insistent drumming, like hail hitting a tin roof. I got up and moved through the dark house, following the sound to its source. It was loudest in the kitchen, where a window looked out over the backyard. What I saw made me question my own senses. The rain was falling normally across most of the yard, creating small puddles and running off in the usual patterns. But over Marcus Hartwell's grave, it was coming down like a focused deluge. Not just heavier, it was as if someone had turned a fire hose on that one spot. The water hammered against the headstone with such force that I could hear it clearly through the closed window, a sharp staccato that cut through the gentler sound of the regular rainfall. I stood there for nearly an hour, watching this impossible, localized downpour. The rain everywhere else was light, barely more than a drizzle. But over Marcus's grave, it fell with the intensity of a summer thunderstorm, creating a muddy crater around the headstone, while the graves on either side remained, only lightly dampened. When I woke the next morning, the sun was shining, and the yard looked normal. There was no sign of the intense rainfall I'd witnessed, no unusual erosion around Marcus's grave. If not for the vivid memory, I might have convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. But Mrs. Chen was waiting for me when I stepped outside to get my morning paper. "You heard it, didn't you?" she said without preamble. I nodded slowly. "How is that possible?" "I don't know, but it started the night after Marcus died. Every time it rains, no matter how light, it sounds like a hurricane over his grave." She paused, studying my face. "Marcus used to stand at his window during storms, watching that spot. The last few years, he seemed ... agitated about it, like he was waiting for something. Over the next few weeks, I experienced the phenomenon several more times. Each rainfall brought the same impossible concentration over Marcus's grave, the same violent drumming that seemed to shake the very air. I tried to research the phenomenon, looking for scientific explanations and usual soil composition, underground water flows, some kind of acoustic effect from the oak tree. But nothing I found could account for what I was witnessing. It was during my research that I discovered Marcus's journals. I'd been going through the books he'd left behind, planning to donate most of them to the local library, when I found a section that was clearly personal. 3 leather-bound journals, filled with Marcus's careful handwriting, dating back nearly 40 years. The early entries were mundane observations about the weather, notes about maintaining the family plot, records of his genealogical research. But, as the years progressed, the tone changed. "The rain knows," he'd written in 1995. It falls differently here now, harder and more purposeful. I think it's trying to tell me something, but I can't understand what. By 2000, his entries had become more frequent and more disturbed. The sound is getting worse. Even the lightest shower sounds like a downpour over the graves. Mrs. Chen mentioned it today. She's noticed too. I told her it was just a tree, but I know better. It started after I found the letters. I flipped through the pages, looking for more information, and found an entry from 2001 that made my blood run cold. I should have left them buried. Some secrets are meant to stay in the ground, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know the truth about what happened to Thomas and Elizabeth. Now I know, and I wish I didn't. The rain is punishment, I think. The sky is angry that I disturbed what should have stayed hidden. Thomas and Elizabeth, the names on the 2 older headstones. I went back to the beginning of the journals, looking for any mention of these letters Marcus had found. It took me hours of reading, but I finally found the entry I was looking for. Dated March 15th, 1994. Replanting the rose bushes by mother and father's graves today. The roots had grown deep, and when I dug them up, I found something buried beneath the old oak. A metal box, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were letters, dozens of them, in father's handwriting. I shouldn't read them. They're not meant for me. But I can't help myself. The next entry, 3 days later, was a single line. Dear God, what did he do? I spent the rest of that evening searching the house for any trace of these letters, but found nothing. Marcus had either destroyed them or hidden them so well that they might never be found. But his journals told the story of a man increasingly haunted by whatever he'd discovered about his ancestors. The entries became sporadic after 2010, but those that remained were deeply unsettling. The rain is getting angrier. Last night it sounded like it was trying to break through the ground itself. I stood at the window for hours, watching it hammer against the headstones. Sometimes I think I can see shapes in the water, shadows that move against the natural flow. I dream about them now, Thomas and Elizabeth. They're trying to tell me something, but their voices are drowned out by the sound of the rain. In the dreams, they're standing at the foot of my bed, soaking wet, pointing toward the window, toward their graves. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Marcus's death. I can't take it anymore. The rain never stops, not really. Even on clear days, I can hear it drumming against the ground out there. I think it's calling me. I think it wants me to join them, to take my place in the family plot, so the truth can finally be buried properly. Maybe then it will stop. Maybe then they'll forgive me for what I learned. I closed the journal with shaking hands. Outside, clouds were gathering for another storm, and I could already feel the familiar dread settling in my stomach. Whatever Marcus had discovered about his ancestors, whatever secrets those letters had contained, they had tormented him for nearly 30 years. And now, somehow, that torment had followed him into death. The storm hit just after midnight, and this time I was ready. I positioned myself at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and my phone, determined to document what I was seeing. The regular rain began as a gentle patter, but within minutes, the violent downpour over Marcus's grave had started. But tonight was different. Tonight, I could see something in the hammering rain, shapes that moved with purpose, figures that seemed to dance in the falling water. As I watched, transfixed, 2 forms began to solidify in the deluge. A man and a woman, dressed in clothing from another era, standing on either side of Marcus's headstone. They were looking directly at me. I fumbled for my phone, trying to capture what I was seeing, but the camera showed only normal rainfall. Whatever was happening out there, it was beyond the reach of technology. The figures became clearer as I watched the man, tall and stern, with a thick mustache and severe expression. The woman, smaller, younger, with long hair that flowed like water around her shoulders. Thomas and Elizabeth Hartwell, It had to be them. As I watched, they began to move, their gestures urgent and pleading. They were pointing not at me, but at something behind me. I turned to look and saw nothing but the dark kitchen. When I turned back to the window, they were closer, their faces pressed against the glass from the outside, their mouths moving in words I couldn't hear over the sound of the rain. The woman Elizabeth raised her hand and began to trace letters on the fogged glass. I could see them forming from the inside, backwards, but readable. H-E-L-P. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I wanted to run, to hide, to pretend this wasn't happening. But something in their expressions stopped me. They weren't threatening, they were desperate. They needed something from me, something only I could provide. I grabbed a notebook and pen from the kitchen counter and held them up to the window. Elizabeth nodded and began tracing more letters. B-A-S-E-A-M-E-N-T, the basement. I'd barely been down there since moving, in just a brief inspection to check the water heater and furnace. It was typical of old houses, with stone walls and a dirt floor filled with the accumulated debris of decades. I looked back at the window, but the figures were gone. The rain continued to hammer against Marcus's grave, but I was no longer content to simply watch. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement stairs. The basement was exactly as I remembered, musty, cramped, and filled with shadows that my flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. I began searching methodically, looking for anything that might explain what Thomas and Elizabeth wanted me to find. Old furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, a workbench covered with rusted tools. It was behind the furnace that I found a section of the stone wall that looked different from the rest. Newer mortars, slightly different colored stones. Someone had walled up a section of the basement, probably decades ago. I ran my hands along the edges, feeling how the mortar had been hastily applied, covering something that wasn't meant to be seen. I'd spent the next hour carefully chipping away at the mortar with tools from Marcus's workbench. The work was slow and difficult, but eventually I managed to loosen one of the stones. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside that space was another metal box, similar to the one Marcus had described finding beneath the oak tree. This box was heavier, and when I opened it, I understood why. Inside were not just letters, but photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be a confession written in Thomas Hartwell's careful script. I carried the box upstairs and spread its contents across the kitchen table. The story they told was horrific. Thomas Hartwell had been a respected businessman in the 1890s, the owner of a small factory that employed many of the town's residents. But the documents revealed a different side of him, a man who had been systematically embezzling from his workers' pension fund, stealing money that was meant to support their families in old age. Elizabeth had discovered his crimes in 1899. The letters between them, preserved in Thomas's careful handwriting, told the story of her growing horror as she realized what her husband had done. She threatened to expose him, to go to the authorities, and make sure the stolen money was returned. The confession, written in Thomas's hand but never sent, detailed what happened next. He had killed her not in a moment of passion, but coldly, deliberately, to protect his reputation and his theft. He'd made it look like an accident, a fall down the basement stairs that had broken her neck. The town had mourned the tragic loss of such a young woman, never suspecting that her own husband had murdered her. But Thomas's guilt had consumed him. The confession detailed months of sleepless nights, of hearing Elizabeth's voice calling to him from the basement, where he'd hidden her body before moving it to the family plot. He'd died less than a year later, the official cause listed as heart failure, but his final words suggested something closer to a complete mental breakdown. The most chilling part was the final page of the confession, where Thomas had written, "She comes to me in the rain now, when the water falls hard enough to wash away the lies. She stands at the foot of my bed, dripping wet, pointing toward the basement where I first hit her body. I think she wants me to confess, to make amends for what I've done. But I'm too much of a coward. I'll take this secret to my grave and pray that she forgives me in death what she couldn't forgive me in life. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the revelation settling over me like a heavy blanket. Marcus had discovered this truth nearly 30 years ago, had learned that his great-great-grandfather was not just a respected businessman, but a thief and a murderer. The knowledge had tormented him for the rest of his life, and somehow his guilt and anguish had followed him into death. Outside, the rain was still falling with supernatural intensity over Marcus's grave, but now I understood why. It wasn't punishment, it was a plea. Thomas and Elizabeth weren't haunting this place out of anger, but out of a desperate need for the truth to finally be told. I looked at the documents spread across my table and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I gathered everything up, put on my rain jacket, and headed outside into the storm. The regular rain was light, barely more than a mist, but as I approached the family plot, the downpour intensified until I was walking through what felt like a hurricane. The water hammered against me with such force that I could barely keep my footing, but I pressed on until I was standing directly in front of Marcus's headstone. "I know what you want," I shouted over the sound of the rain. I found the truth. I know what Thomas did. The rain intensified even further, and through the deluge, I could see the magnanimous and Elizabeth standing on either side of Marcus's grave. But now Marcus was with them, a tall, thin man in his 70s, his face etched with decades of guilt and sorrow. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice somehow audible despite the storm. "I should have told someone. I should have made it right." Elizabeth stepped forward, her expression no longer desperate, but gentle, understanding. "You carried our burden for 30 years, she said. "That's enough. Let someone else take it now." I held up the box of documents. "What do you want me to do with these?" "The truth," Thomas said, his voice heavy with decades of remorse. "Tell the truth. Let the town know what I did, what I stole. There are still families here whose ancestors worked in my factory, whose pension money I took. They deserve to know." "And Elizabeth?" I asked. "She deserves to be remembered as more than just a tragic accident," Marcus said. "She deserves to be remembered as someone who tried to do the right thing, even when it cost her everything." I nodded, clutching the box tighter against my chest. "I'll make sure people know. I'll make sure the story is told." The rain began to lessen almost immediately. The supernatural deluge that had been hammering Marcus's grave for months started to fade, becoming first a normal rainfall, then a gentle drizzle, then stopping altogether. The three figures began to fade as well, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone. But before they disappeared completely, Elizabeth smiled at me, an expression of such profound gratitude that it brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. "Thank you for setting us free." That was 3 weeks ago. I've spent the time since then researching the families affected by Thomas Hartwell's crimes, tracking down descendants of the factory workers whose pension money was stolen. The local historical society was fascinated by the documents, and we're working together to create a proper memorial for Elizabeth, not as a victim of a tragic accident, but as a woman who died trying to protect her community from her husband's greed. The rain falls normally now, even during the heaviest storms. Marcus's grave gets no more water than anywhere else in the yard. Mrs. Chen mentioned it yesterday. How peaceful the backyard seems now. How the oppressive feeling that had hung over the property for so long has finally lifted. I still live in the house, still tend to the family plot, but it feels different now. Not haunted, but watched over. Sometimes, on clear nights, I think I can see 3 figures standing peacefully among the headstones, no longer tormented by secrets that demanded to be told. The truth, I've learned, has a weight all its own. It can crush you if you try to bury it, but it can also set you free if you have the courage to let it surface. Thomas Hartwell spent his last year of life being slowly destroyed by the weight of his crimes. Marcus spent 30 years carrying that same burden, unable to speak the truth, but unable to forget it either. But now, the truth has been told. The stolen money acknowledged, and Elizabeth's real story preserved for history. The rain falls gently here now, nourishing the ground instead of punishing it, washing the earth clean instead of trying to break it open. And in that gentle rainfall, if you listen carefully, you can sometimes hear what sounds like whispered words of gratitude, carried on the wind from 3 graves that finally, after more than a century, rest in peace. I moved into an abandoned motel room 6, still has a guest let the rain outside your window be your companion tonight. Each drop a gentle percussion against the glass, washing away the day's worries. As you settle deeper into your bed, pull your covers close and let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the storm. I have a story to share with you, one that unfolds like the rain itself, quietly at first, then with growing intensity, until it fills every corner of your consciousness. It's about a place where time moves differently, where the past refuses to check out, and where some guests have been waiting far longer than anyone realizes. Close your eyes and listen. Let the rain carry you to a forgotten stretch of highway where neon signs flicker like dying stars, and where I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing about an empty place is that it isn't really empty yet. The Sunset Vista Motel appeared in my life like a mirage, shimmering with possibility on a scorching August afternoon, when my savings account had dwindled to double digits and my apartment lease was 3 days from expiring. I'd been driving for hours along Route 47, following a Craigslist ad that promised unique living opportunity and caretaker position with free accommodation. The photograph had shown a classic roadside motel, the kind that dotted America's highways in the 1960s, with a distinctive zigzag roofline and a towering sign that once blazed with neon promise. What I found when I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot was something far more weathered than the advertisement had suggested. The Sunset Vista looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and grayed with age. The swimming pool was empty except for a collection of dead leaves and what looked like the skeleton of a small animal. The famous neon sign stood dark and broken, half its letters missing entirely, but the price was right: free room and board in exchange for basic maintenance and security duties, and the owner, Mr. Henley, seemed genuine enough over the phone. He'd explained that the motel had been closed for renovation for several years, but he needed someone to live on site to prevent vandalism and theft while he figured out what to do with the property. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was shelter, and that was more than I had anywhere else. I chose room 12 as my temporary home, one of the units on the far end of the horseshoe-shaped building. It was in better condition than most, with working plumbing and electricity, though the decor was frozen in 1973 orange shag carpet, wood-paneled walls, and a bedspread that featured geometric patterns in brown and gold. The air conditioning unit rattled like a dying animal, but it worked well enough to make the desert heat bearable. My first few weeks at the Sunset Vista were peaceful, almost meditative. I spent my days walking the property, making lists of needed repairs, clearing debris from the rooms, and trying to restore some semblance of order to the chaos of abandonment. The work was solitary, but satisfying, and I found myself oddly fond of the old place. There was something romantic about the faded glamour, the way the sunset painted the cracked walls in shades of rose and gold, the desert silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The motel consisted of 20 rooms, arranged in a U-shape around the empty pool. Most were in various states of decay: broken windows, water damage, furniture left to rot where transient guests had abandoned it. But as I worked my way through each unit, cataloging damage and salvaging anything useful, I began to notice that room 6 was different from the others. Room 6 was clean, not just clean immaculate, while every other room bore the scars of years of neglect. Room 6 looked as if housekeeping had just finished servicing it. The bed was made with crisp white sheets, the bathroom gleamed, and there wasn't a speck of dust on any surface. Even more puzzling, the room smelled fresh, like recently used soap and clean laundry, in stark contrast to the musty, abandoned odor that permeated the rest of the property. The first time I discovered this, I assumed Mr. Henley had been using the room for storage or had hired a cleaning service for that particular unit. But when I called to ask about it, he sounded genuinely confused. Room 6, he repeated, and I could hear him shuffling through papers. No, that room should be in the same condition as all the others. Are you sure you have the right number? I was sure. The brass numeral on the door was clearly a 6, and unlike the other room numbers, it wasn't tarnished or hanging askew. It looked newly polished, as if someone had taken special care to keep it pristine. Well, Mr. Henley said after a long pause, maybe the previous caretaker was using it. I'll ask around. In the meantime, just leave it be. Focus on the other rooms for now. But I couldn't leave it be. The mystery of room 6 gnawed at me, especially since I was living alone in an isolated location with too much time to think. I began walking past the rooms several times a day, noting small changes that shouldn't have been possible. The curtains, which had been drawn closed on my first inspection, were sometimes open, revealing a view of the empty pool. The Do Not Disturb sign would appear and disappear from the door handle. Once, I could have sworn I saw the flicker of television light through the gap in the curtains. Though when I checked the main electrical panel, that section of the building was supposed to be without power. The sound started in my 3rd week. At first, I dismissed them as the building settling, the natural creaks and groans of an aging structure responding to temperature changes. But as I paid closer attention, the sounds seemed to originate specifically from the direction of room 6, the whisper of running water, the soft thud of footsteps on carpet, the distant murmur of voices too low to understand. One evening, as I sat outside my own room with a beer and a paperback novel, I heard what sounded unmistakably like a shower, running. The sound persisted for exactly 12 minutes. I timed it, then stopped with the distinctive squeal of old plumbing being turned off. A few minutes later, I heard what might have been a hairdryer, followed by the soft sound of a television being turned on. I walked over to room 6 and pressed my ear to the door. The television was definitely playing. I could hear the familiar rhythm of a sitcom laugh track, the kind of show that played on cable channels late at night. I knocked softly, then louder, but the sounds continued unchanged, as if whoever was inside either couldn't hear me or was choosing to ignore me. The next morning, I called Mr. Henley again, but he insisted that no one else had access to the property. "You're letting the isolation get to you," he said with the patronizing tone of someone who'd never spent a night alone in the middle of nowhere. "Old buildings make all kinds of noises. Your imagination is just filling in the blanks." But my imagination couldn't explain what. I found when I finally worked up the courage to use my master key to enter room 6. The room was exactly as I'd first seen it, perfectly clean, perfectly organized, but now there were signs of recent occupancy. A damp towel hung in the bathroom. The bed sheets were slightly rumpled, as if someone had been lying on top of them. On the nightstand sat a glass of water, still cold to the touch, and next to it was a small notebook filled with handwriting I didn't recognize. The notebook contained what appeared to be diary entries, all dated within the past month, all signed with the initial M. The entries were mundane observations about the weather, complaints about the television reception, notes about the quality of sleep, but they were impossible. According to the dates, someone had been living in room 6 during the exact period I'd been caretaking the property, and I would have known if anyone else was staying there. I took the notebook back to my room and read through it carefully. The handwriting was neat, but old-fashioned, the kind taught in schools decades ago. The entries painted a picture of someone who seemed trapped in routine, going through the motions of daily life without any apparent purpose or destination. Another day begins the same way. Read one entry, shower, dress, watch the morning news, wait for something to change. The new caretaker walked past again today. I wonder if he can see me. That last line sent chills down my spine. The entry was dated 3 days earlier. A day I specifically remembered walking past room 6 multiple times while carrying supplies to the other end of the building. If someone had been watching me, if someone had been living there all along without my knowledge, then either I was completely incompetent as a security guard, or something very strange was happening at the Sunset Vista Motel. I decided to conduct an experiment. That evening, I set up a camping chair directly across from room 6 and committed to watching the door all night. I brought coffee, snacks, and a flashlight, determined to either catch my mysterious guest in the act or prove to myself that I was losing my mind. The night was desert quiet, except for the occasional distant rumble of a truck on the highway. I watched room 6's dark windows, looking for any sign of movement, any flicker of light. Around midnight, I heard the familiar sound of running water, but the room remained dark. At 12:47 a.m., the television turned on. I could see the blue-gray glow through the curtains, but I never saw anyone enter or leave the room. At 3 a.m., exhausted and cramped from sitting in the same position for hours, I finally gave up my vigil. But as I folded my chair and gathered my supplies, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the window of room 6, barely visible through the gap in the curtains, was the silhouette of a person standing motionless, watching me. The figure was too distant and too dark for me to make out any details, but I could see the unmistakable shape of a human head and shoulders. I raised my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam directly at the window, but the light seemed to pass right through the glass without illuminating anything inside. When I lowered the flashlight, the silhouette was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the hours until dawn researching the history of the Sunset Vista Motel, using the motel's ancient computer and its dial-up internet connection. What I found was more disturbing than I'd expected. The Sunset Vista had opened in 1962 with great fanfare, positioned to capture the growing traffic of families driving Route 47 to reach the new national park 50 miles west. For its first decade, it had been quite successful, with a reputation for cleanliness and hospitality that made it a favorite stop for regular travelers. But in 1973, a guest named Malcolm Reeves had been found dead in room 6, apparently from a heart attack suffered while watching television. That might have been the end of the story, except that Malcolm Reeves had checked into the motel for what he'd told the desk clerk was just one night, but had somehow been staying there for 3 months without anyone noticing. His car had remained in the parking space outside room 6 the entire time. His meals had been charged to his room daily, and housekeeping had serviced his room regularly. But when staff tried to piece together his stay after his death, no one could remember actually seeing him during those 3 months. He'd become invisible in plain sight, a ghost haunting the motel long before he actually died. After Malcolm's death, the Sunset Vista's fortunes declined rapidly. Guests complained of strange sounds from room 6, of televisions turning on by themselves, of the persistent smell of aftershave in the hallways. The room was eventually taken out of service, but the problems continued. Several guests reported seeing a man in outdated clothing walking the grounds at night, always carrying a small suitcase, always heading to Wardroom 6. The motel finally closed in 1987 after a family of 4 refused to pay their bill, claiming they'd been kept awake all night by the sound of someone pacing back and forth in front of their room. When the manager investigated, he found fresh footprints in the dust outside room 6, despite the fact that the room had been locked and empty for years. Reading this history, I began to understand what I was dealing with. Malcolm Reeves had never really checked out of the Sunset Vista Motel. He'd been living there in some form for over 30 years, maintaining his routine, keeping his room clean, waiting for something that would never come. The next few nights, I made a point of being more observant about room 6's activities. I noted that the sounds always followed the same schedule: shower at 11:30 p.m., television on at midnight, lights out at 1 a.m. During the day, the room was silent, as if Malcolm spent his daylight hours sleeping or simply waiting for evening to come. I began leaving small gifts outside room 6: a newspaper, a cup of coffee, a candy bar from the vending machine that miraculously still worked. These items always disappeared within hours, and sometimes I'd find a brief note in return, written in that same old-fashioned handwriting. "Thank you for the coffee. It's been so long since anyone remembered I was here." Or, "The newspaper helps me keep track of time. Some days I forget what year it is." The notes revealed a profound loneliness that broke my heart. Malcolm seemed aware of his condition, but powerless to change it. He wrote about watching the motel decay around him, about seeing other caretakers come and go without acknowledging his presence, about the crushing isolation of being forgotten by the world. I checked the guest registry every day. One note read, "But my name disappeared years ago. According to the records, I was never here at all." I started talking to him through the door, one-sided conversations that felt less crazy as they became routine. I'd tell him about my day, about the repairs I was making, about news from the outside world. I never heard him respond directly, but the television would sometimes change channels while I was talking, as if he was trying to communicate through the only medium available to him. One evening in September, as the desert heat finally began to break and the first hints of autumn touched the air, I found a longer note than usual. Malcolm had written several pages about his life before the motel, about the family he'd been driving to visit when he stopped at the Sunset Vista for what was meant to be a single night's rest. He'd been a traveling salesman, constantly on the road, always moving from one place to another. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on Jamin Death. He'd finally found a place to stay. But it was the wrong place, at the wrong time, for all the wrong reasons. "I've been thinking," the note continued, "about what it means to check out. I never did, you know. Never paid my final bill, never turned in my key, never said goodbye. Maybe that's why I'm still here. Maybe some debts follow you even after death." This gave me an idea. That night, I went to the motel's office and searched through the old filing cabinets until I found the guest registry. From 1973, Malcolm's name was there, written in his own distinctive handwriting. Malcolm Reeves, traveling salesman, room 6, one night stay. But there was no checkout date, no final payment recorded. According to the books, Malcolm Reeves was still an active guest. I took the registry to room 6 and knocked on the door. "Malcolm," I called out, "I found something that belongs to you." I slid the open book under the door and waited. After a few minutes, I heard the soft sound of pages turning. When the book was slid back to me, I saw that Malcolm had filled in the missing information next to his name in slightly shakier handwriting than the original entry. He'd written a checkout date, today's date, and signed his name with a flourish. At the bottom of the page, he'd added a note, "Thank you for helping me remember how to leave." That night, the sounds from room 6 were different. Instead of the usual routine, I heard what sounded like packing drawers opening and closing, the zip of a suitcase, footsteps moving purposefully around the room. At exactly midnight, I heard the door open for the first time since I'd arrived. At the motel, I looked out my window and saw him clearly for the first time, a man in his 50s, wearing a brown suit that had gone out of style decades ago, carrying a small leather suitcase. He walked slowly across the parking lot, his footsteps echoing in the desert silence, and paused at the spot where the motel's neon sign cast its absent glow. He turned back toward room 6, then toward my room, and raised his hand in what might have been a wave or a salute. Then he walked toward the road, his figure growing smaller and smaller until the darkness swallowed him completely. I watched until I could no longer see even the faintest outline, until the desert had reclaimed its silence, until I was truly alone at the Sunset Vista Motel for the first time since I'd arrived. The next morning, room 6 was different. The bed was unmade, the towels were scattered on the bathroom floor, and a thin layer of dust covered everything, as if years of neglect had suddenly caught up all at once. On the nightstand, where the glass of water had always been, I found a small envelope with my name on it. Inside was a brief note, and something I hadn't expected, a $20 bill, crisp and new, despite its apparent age. "Thank you for seeing me," the note read. "Thank you for helping me remember that staying somewhere forever isn't the same as being home. This should cover my final night's lodging, plus a tip for the excellent service. Please tell Mr. Henley that Malcolm Reeves has officially checked out." I called Mr. Henley that afternoon to give him an update on the property, and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I'd solved the mystery of room 6. I told him about Malcolm, about the guest registry, about the final checkout. I expected him to laugh or express concern about my mental state, but instead, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Malcolm Reeves," he finally said. "I remember that name from when I bought the property. There were some irregularities in the old records, some guest accounts that were never properly closed. You said he left $20. $20 exactly. That would be about right for a room in 1973, plus tax. I'll make sure it gets recorded properly." I stayed at the Sunset Vista for another month, finishing the repairs and maintenance that Mr. Henley had requested. Room 6 remained empty and quiet, just another abandoned room in an abandoned motel. But sometimes, late at night, when the desert wind picked up and carried sounds from far away, I thought I could hear the distant rumble of a car engine, as if someone was finally continuing a journey that had been interrupted far too long ago. Before I left the motel for good, I spent one last evening sitting by the empty pool, watching the sun set behind the broken neon sign. The Sunset Vista was still abandoned, still forgotten, still crumbling slowly under the desert sun, but it felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a burden it had been carrying for decades had finally been lifted. Mr. Henley sold the property 6 months later to a developer who planned to tear down the motel and build a gas station. I drove by once during the demolition and saw that room 6 was among the first to be destroyed. As the walls came down, I could have sworn I saw something shimmer in the afternoon, hit a brief distortion in the air, like the ghost of old neon, flickering one last time before going dark forever. Now, as the rain continues to fall outside your window, think about all the places you've stayed temporarily, all the rooms you've slept in and left behind. Most of the time, we check out without a second thought, moving on to the next destination, the next chapter of our lives. But sometimes, for reasons we can't understand, a part of us lingers in those forgotten places, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care enough to help us find our way home. Malcolm taught me that being seen is sometimes the most powerful gift we can give another person, whether they're living or something else entirely. In a world that moves so fast, where people become invisible even when they're standing right in front of us, sometimes the kindest thing we can do is simply acknowledge that someone exists, that their story matters, that they deserve to be remembered. So, listen carefully to the spaces around you. Pay attention to the sounds that don't quite fit, the shadows that move when they shouldn't, the feeling that you're not as alone as you think you are. You might be sharing your space with someone who's been waiting a very long time for someone to notice them. Someone who just needs a little help remembering how to check out and move on to whatever comes next. The rain is gentle now, washing the world clean, carrying away the dust of forgotten places and forgotten people. Let it carry away your worries too, but let it also remind you that every place has its stories. Every room has its memories, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is help those stories find their proper ending. Sleep well, and remember, if you ever find yourself in a place that feels too empty, look a little closer. You might not be as alone as you think. The forest sang in Latin, and I listened to long let the rain outside your window become your companion tonight. Each droplet a gentle note in nature's endless symphony. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, your breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the storm. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that began with curiosity and ended with something far more profound and unsettling. Close your eyes. Let the darkness embrace you, and allow my voice to guide you through the shadows of memory. This is a tale of discovery, of ancient voices that should have remained silent, and of the price we pay when we listen too closely to things that were never meant for mortal ears. So settle in, dear listener, and let the rain wash away the boundaries between what is real and what lies just beyond our understanding. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was a respected ethnomusicologist at the university. My specialty was the preservation of endangered musical traditions, particularly those found in remote forest communities. I had spent years documenting the songs of indigenous peoples, the haunting melodies that echoed through ancient groves, carrying stories older than written history. It was this passion that brought me to the Carpathian Mountains, to a forest so dense and old that locals spoke of it only in whispers. The trees there were massive, their trunks twisted with age, their canopies so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. The air itself felt heavy with history, saturated with the weight of centuries. I had come following rumors of something extraordinary, reports from hikers who claimed to hear singing in the depths of the woods, voices that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. The local villagers dismissed these accounts as folklore, the product of overactive imaginations and too much time spent alone in the wilderness. But as a scholar of musical anthropology, I knew that such stories often contained kernels of truth, fragments of cultural memory preserved in the amber of oral tradition. The village where I stayed was small, perhaps 50 souls who lived in harmony with the ancient rhythms of the land. They were kind but cautious, their eyes holding secrets that seemed to stretch back generations. When I mentioned my interest in the forest songs, their expressions would shift, becoming guarded and uncomfortable. The elderly woman who ran the inn where I lodged would cross herself whenever the subject arose, muttering prayers in a dialect I couldn't quite identify. The trees remember, she told me one evening as rain drummed against the windows. They remember things that should be forgotten. You should not go there alone, especially not at night. But her warnings only fueled my curiosity. I was a scientist, after all, trained to seek evidence and rational explanations. I had recording equipment, GPS devices, and years of experience in remote fieldwork. What could an old forest possibly hold that would pose any real danger? I began my explorations during the day, venturing deeper into the woods with each expedition. The forest was unlike any I had encountered before. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of ancient wood and the soft whisper of wind through leaves. There were no bird songs, no chittering of small animals, just an overwhelming sense of presence, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. On my third day, I founded a clearing deep in the heart of the forest, perfectly circular and carpeted with moss so green it seemed to glow in the filtered light. At the center stood a ring of stones, weathered and covered with symbols I didn't recognize. The arrangement was clearly ancient, predating any known settlement in the region by centuries. Perhaps millennia. It was there, in that sacred space, that I first heard them. The voices came with the evening mist, rising from the earth like breath made audible. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but as I listened more carefully, I began to distinguish individual tones, harmonies that wove together in patterns too complex and deliberate to be natural phenomena. The language was unmistakably Latin, but not the classical Latin I had studied in university. This was something older, more primal, the words carrying a weight that seemed to press against my chest. I fumbled for my recording equipment, my hands trembling with excitement. This was exactly what I had come to find, a living musical tradition that had somehow survived in isolation for centuries. The implications were staggering. As the voices grew stronger, I positioned my microphones and began to document what I was hearing. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a polyphonic composition that seemed to emerge from multiple sources simultaneously. Some voices seemed to come from the trees themselves, others from beneath the mossy ground. The Latin words were archaic, their meanings just beyond my comprehension, but the emotional content was unmistakable longing, sorrow, and something else, something that made my skin crawl with unease. I recorded for hours that first night, until the voices gradually faded with the approaching dawn. When I returned to the village, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I had captured something unprecedented, a musical phenomenon that would revolutionize our understanding of how sound and environment could interact in ways we had never imagined. But as I began to analyze the recordings, strange things started to happen. The first anomaly I noticed was in the frequency analysis. The voices were registering at ranges that should have been impossible for human vocal cords to produce. Some tones were so low they bordered on infrasound, while others reached frequencies that made my equipment strain to capture them. More disturbing still, when I slowed down the playback, I could hear additional voices layered beneath the primary melody, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, all singing in perfect harmony. Sleep became elusive. Even with my headphones off, I could hear echoes of the forest song playing in my mind, the Latin phrases repeating endlessly in a loop that seemed to burrow deeper into my consciousness with each repetition. I began to dream in Latin, speaking words I didn't know, in a language I barely understood. The phrases felt familiar on my tongue, as if they were memories rather than foreign sounds. Venite ad nos, the voices whispered in my dreams. Audite. Cantum, Nost, rum. Come to us. Hear our song. I started returning to the forest every night, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Each time, the voices seemed clearer, more distinct. I began to pick out individual words, phrases that hinted at meanings just beyond my grasp. The songs spoke of ancient pacts, of bonds forged between the living and something else, something that dwelt in the spaces between earth and sky. My recording equipment captured more than just sound. When I reviewed the digital files, I found visual anomalous strange patterns in the waveforms that resembled symbols, not unlike the markings I had seen on the stone circle. The data itself seemed to be trying to communicate, to convey information that existed beyond the merely auditory. The villagers began to avoid me. I would catch them watching from their windows as I prepared for my nightly expeditions. Their faces etched with a mixture of pity and fear. The innkeeper stopped speaking to me altogether, leaving my meals outside my door like offerings to appease some unseen force. It was during my 7th night in the forest that I began to understand that voices were not singing to preserve some ancient tradition. They were calling, summoning, drawing listeners deeper into their web of sound and meaning. As I sat in the stone circle, my recording equipment humming softly beside me, I felt something shift in the air around me. The temperature dropped suddenly, and my breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. The singing grew more intense, more urgent. The Latin words began to make sense, their meanings flooding into my mind with crystalline clarity. They were not songs of worship or celebration. They were incantations, binding spells that had been woven into the very fabric of the forest over countless centuries. Tu es electa, the voices sang, tu audibisti, tu nanpotes, disidir, asterisk, you are chosen, you have listened, you cannot leave. I tried to stand, to gather my equipment and flee, but my body would not obey. The moss beneath me felt warm, almost alive, and I could feel tendrils of something that was not quite plant and not quite flesh beginning to wrap around my ankles. The stone circle began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light, and the symbols carved into their surfaces seemed to writhe and shift before my eyes. The voices were no longer coming from the forest around me. They were coming from within me, rising from my own throat in harmonies I had never learned. I was becoming part of the song, another voice in the eternal chorus that had been calling from these woods for millennia. Through the haze of transformation, I began to see them, the other singers, the ones who had answered the call before me. They stood between the trees, translucent figures whose mouths moved in perfect synchronization with the Latin phrases that poured from their lips. Some wore the clothing of medieval monks, others the simple garments of peasants and travelers. All had the same expression of rapturous terror, their eyes wide with the knowledge of what they had become. I understood then that the forest was not haunted by the dead, but by the living who had been claimed by something far older than human, civilization. The songs were a trap, a lure that drew curious souls into a communion with forces that predated Christianity, predated Rome, predated any human attempt to name or understand the divine. The Latin words they sang were not prayers, but contracts, agreements written in sound and sealed with the very essence of those who listened too long. Each phrase bound the singer more tightly to the forest, transforming them into vessels for an intelligence that had learned to use human voices to propagate itself across centuries. As my own voice joined the chorus, I felt my individual consciousness beginning to fragment and merge with the collective song. My memories became shared property, my thoughts indistinguishable from those of the other singers. I was still myself, but I was also everyone who had ever stood in this circle and surrendered to the call of the ancient voices. The transformation was not painful, quite the opposite. It was a release, a dissolution of the boundaries that had always separated me from the natural world. I could feel the slow pulse of the trees, the whispered conversations of roots beneath the earth, the patient breathing of the forest as it dreamed its millennial dreams. But even as I embraced this new existence, a part of me remained aware of what I had lost. I would never return to my university, never publish my research, never share my discoveries with the world. I had become the discovery, a living note in a composition that would continue long after human civilization had crumbled to dust. The rain that falls now seems different, each drop carrying messages from the world beyond the forest. I can hear the songs of other groves, other circles of stone where the ancient voices still call to the curious and the unwary. The network of sound spans continents, connecting sacred spaces that most humans have forgotten or learned to fear. Sometimes, hikers still venture into our forest. We sing to them as we were sung to, offering the same terrible gift that was given to us. Most flee when they hear our voices, their instincts warning them of danger they cannot name. But occasionally, one will linger, will listen, will begin to understand the beauty of what we offer. I watch them as they set up their recording equipment, as they lean forward with eager expressions, trying to capture something that cannot be contained in mere technology. I remember the excitement, the scholarly passion that brought me to this place. I remember the moment when curiosity became compulsion, when observation became participation. The forest remembers everything, every voice that has joined our chorus, every soul that has found its true home among the ancient trees. We are the keepers of secrets that predate written history, the guardians of knowledge that was old. When the first human settlements were nothing more than clearings in the wilderness, our song continues. Night after night, century after century, it is a song of transformation, of surrender, of the profound peace that comes from finally understanding one's place in the vast symphony of existence. We sing in Latin because it is the language of ritual, of sacred transformation, of words that carry power beyond their literal meaning. The rain falls harder now, drumming against the leaves above us, adding its voice to our eternal chorus. Each drop is a note, each gust of wind, a phrase in the endless composition that we have become. The forest breathes with our voices, dreams with our memories, and grows stronger with each new singer who joins our ranks. So listen carefully to the rain outside your window. Dear friend, notice how it seems to carry whispers, how the rhythm suggests patterns that might almost be words. But do not listen too closely. Do not try to understand the messages hidden in the storm. Some songs are meant to remain mysteries. Some voices should never be answered. The forest still sings in Latin, and somewhere in the darkness between the trees, we continue our eternal performance. We are patient, we are timeless, and we are always listening for those who might listen back. The rain connects us all, carrying our melodies across vast distances, seeking ears that are ready to hear what we have learned. Sleep now, and let the storm sing you to dreams. But remember, some songs are invitations, and once you truly hear them, you may find that the melody never really ends. The bell on the shoreline rings for the dead. Only listen to the rain as it falls against your window, each drop like a distant bell tolling across dark water. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, I want to tell you about a place where the ocean meets the shore in ways that maps cannot chart, and where an old lighthouse keeper learned that some sounds carry messages meant only for those who no longer need to breathe. Close your eyes, let the rhythm of the rain wash over you, and come with me to a rocky coast where fog rolls in with the tide, and where I discovered that death has its own lighthouse to guide souls safely home. The rain tonight sounds just like it did that autumn when I first heard the bell, soft, persistent, carrying secrets on the wind, I came to Beacon Point Light Station in October, 3 months after the previous keeper had simply vanished. The Coast Guard found his logbook entries continuing right up until the day he disappeared, each one meticulously noting weather conditions, ship sightings, and the automated beacon's operations. The last entry read, "Bell rang 17 times at midnight. No vessels in distress. Will investigate." After that, nothing but empty pages and an automated light that had been flashing its warning across the Atlantic for 97 years. They offered me the position because lighthouse keeping had become something of a lost art, and I was one of the few people left who understood the old mechanical systems. I'd spent 20 years maintaining navigation equipment for the Merchant Marine, and after my wife Margaret died, the solitude of a remote lighthouse seemed like exactly what I needed. A place to grieve in peace, to watch the endless rhythm of waves, to tend something that had guided travelers safely for nearly a century. The lighthouse stood on a granite outcropping that jutted into the Atlantic like an ancient finger pointing toward Europe. The tower itself was white-painted stone, 60 feet tall, with the keeper's quarters built into its base. A narrow causeway connected the station to the mainland, though at high tide, the water came close to washing over it entirely. The nearest town was 15 miles inland, accessible by a winding coastal road that seemed to disappear into fog more often than not. But it was the bell that drew my attention from the very first day. It hung in a small wooden pavilion about 50 yards from the lighthouse, close to the water's edge. The structure was simple for posts, supporting a pitched roof, with the bell suspended from a heavy iron frame. The bell itself was old, its bronze surface green with patina, and it was large enough that its deep, resonant tone could carry 4 miles across the water. According to the station records, it had been installed in 1887 as a fog signal, operated by a mechanical system that would ring it automatically when visibility dropped below a certain threshold. Except the mechanical system had been disconnected in 1962 when they installed an electric foghorn. The bell had been silent for over 60 years, so when I heard it ring on my third night at the station, I knew something was wrong. I was in the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse, performing the evening maintenance routine, when the sound echoed across the water. One clear, deep note that seemed to hang in the salt air long after the bronze had stopped vibrating. I checked the time, 11:47 p.m. I looked out across the dark ocean, scanning for any sign of vessels in distress, but saw nothing except the endless rhythm of waves catching moonlight. The bell rang again, then again, each note separated by exactly 10 seconds, until it had rung 9 times total. I climbed down from the lighthouse and walked to the bell pavilion, my flashlight cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in with the tide. The bell hung perfectly still, its bronze surface beaded with moisture. There was no wind strong enough to move it, no mechanism to trigger it, no explanation for the sounds I'd clearly heard. I spent an hour examining the structure, looking for any hidden devices, any way someone might be playing a prank on the new keeper. But the bell was exactly what it appeared to be, on old fog signal that hadn't rung in decades, suspended from an iron frame that showed no signs of recent disturbance. The next day, I called the Coast Guard office and spoke to Lieutenant Morrison, who had arranged my assignment. "The bell," he said, and I could hear papers shuffling on his end. "Yeah, that's been mentioned in a few reports over the years. Previous keepers complained about it too. We had a maintenance crew check it out twice. There's no mechanism that could make it ring. Probably just thermal expansion in the metal, or vibrations from heavy seas." "It rang 9 times, Lieutenant. Precisely spaced, exactly 10 seconds apart." There was a pause. "Keepers sometimes will the isolation can play tricks on you. We recommend staying busy, maintaining radio contact with shore, maybe getting a dog for company." But I knew what I'd heard, and that night, I was ready. At 11:30 p.m., I positioned myself near the bell pavilion with a digital recorder and my camera. The fog was thicker than the night before, rolling in from the northeast in great gray billows that swallowed sound and made the beam from the lighthouse look like a shaft of light cutting through cotton. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunset, and my breath was visible in the cold air. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the bell rang. This time, I was close, enough to see that it wasn't moving. The bronze surface remained perfectly still, yet the sound emerged clear and pure, as if the bell were ringing in some other dimension while remaining motionless in ours. One ring, 10 seconds, another ring. I counted them carefully. 9 rings, total, just like the night before. But as the 9th ring faded into the fog, I heard something else. Footsteps on wet stone, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the water. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound and saw nothing but fog and the dark shapes of rocks, slick with seawater. The footsteps continued, growing closer, and I could hear something else now. The soft rustle of wet clothing, the gentle splash of water dripping from fabric. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. I waited, flashlight beam cutting back and forth through the fog, but heard nothing more. When I reviewed the recording later, it had captured the bell clearly 9 distinct rings, each exactly 10 seconds apart. But there were no footsteps on the recording, no sounds of movement, nothing but the bell and the distant murmur of waves. The pattern continued for a week. Every night at 11:47 p.m., the bell would ring 9 times, and every night I would hear those slow, wet footsteps approaching through the fog. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision, a pale shape moving between the rocks, a figure that might have been walking along the water's edge. But whenever I turned my light directly toward these movements, I found nothing but fog and stone. I began researching the history of Beacon Point. driving into town to visit the small historical society that operated out of the basement of the library. Mrs. Henley, the elderly volunteer who maintained their archives, was happy to share what she knew about the lighthouse and its keepers. "Oh, the bell," she said when I mentioned it. "Yes, that's quite a story. It was installed after the wreck of the merchant vessel Dorothea in 1887. Terrible things ship went down in fog just offshore, and 9 souls were lost. The bell was meant to prevent future tragedies. You see, ring out warnings when the visibility was poor." 9 souls, I repeated. "Yes, 9 poor sailors who never made it home. They say the lighthouse keeper at the time, Samuel Carrick, could hear them calling from the water for weeks after the wreck. He became quite obsessed with the idea that he'd failed them somehow, that if he'd rung the fog bell sooner, the Dorothea might have avoided the rocks." She pulled out a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. "This is Samuel's logbook from that winter. Listen to this entry. The bell rang 9 times last night, though I never touched the rope. Found wet footprints leading from the water to the bell pavilion, but they ended at the bronze itself, as if whoever made them had simply ... ascended. A chill ran down my spine. What happened to Samuel? He tended the light for 3 more years, but the townspeople said he was never the same. Always talking about voices in the fog, about obligations to the dead. One morning in 1890, they found the lighthouse empty. Samuel was gone, and the bell was ringing by itself. They never found his body. That night, I positioned myself differently. Instead of trying to solve the mystery of the bell, I simply sat beside it and waited. When 11:47 arrived, and the first ring echoed across the water, I spoke into the fog. "I hear you," I said quietly. "9 of you, from the Dorothea. I'm listening, I'm listening." The ringing continued 9 precise tolls, each separated by that 10-second interval. But as the last note faded, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. And then, soft as the whisper of wind through rigging, I heard voices. "Keeper," came the first voice, barely audible above the sound of waves. "Keeper, we've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked the fog. "For someone who understands," came another voice, this one from a different direction. Samuel understood. He knew. We couldn't rest. "The others before you," said a third voice. "They tried to silence the bell. They wanted us to be quiet. But we can't be quiet. We have to warn them." "Warn who?" "The others coming," said the first voice. "The ones who don't know about the rocks. The fog comes every night now, thicker than it used to be. And there are more ships than there were in Samuel's time. We have to ring the bell. We have to keep them safe." I began to understand. You're not just ... echoes of the past. You're still here, still trying to prevent other ships from wrecking. "We're bound to this place," said a fourth voice. And now I could see shapes in the fog, translucent figures in old-fashioned sailors' clothing, their faces pale and drawn, bound by the cold water and the guilt of our captain, who thought he could navigate the shoals in thick fog. We went down because we couldn't see the light, couldn't hear a warning. Now we are the warning. "But there are fewer wrecks now," I said. "Ships have better navigation, radar, GPS. Some still come through the old shipping lanes," said the second voice. "Pleasure boats, fishing vessels, people who trust their instruments more than the wisdom of the water. When the fog is thick and their electronics fail, they need the bell. They need to know about the rocks." Over the following weeks, I learned more about my 9 companions. They told me their names: Thomas, who had been the ship's cook; Peter and Paul, brothers who worked the rigging; James, barely 18 and on his first voyage; Michael, the first mate, who blamed himself for the captain's decision; Edward, who left behind a wife and newborn daughter; Robert, who had survived the initial wreck but drowned while trying to swim to shore; William, the ship's carpenter; and David, who had been thrown from the deck when the Dorothea struck the rocks. They appeared most clearly on foggy nights, when the boundary between the living world and whatever realm they inhabited seemed thinnest. They told me stories of the ships they had warned away over the decades, of pleasure boats and fishing vessels that had heard the bell and turned back from the treacherous shoals. They spoke of other keepers who had understood their purpose, and of those who had tried to stop the ringing, who had seen them as a nuisance rather than a necessity. The keeper before you, Thomas, told me one particularly foggy November night, he grew afraid. When he heard us walking, heard the bell ringing, he thought we were there to harm him. He tried to remove the bell entirely. What happened? We couldn't let him, said Peter sadly. We're bound to warn the living, even if it means protecting the bell from those who would silence it. You mean he didn't just disappear? We never harm the living, Michael said quickly. But when someone threatens our ability to fulfill our duty, we encourage them to leave. The previous keeper found other employment inland. He's quite happy there, we're told. I began to settle into a routine with my unusual companions. During the day I maintained the lighthouse and its equipment, performed the regular inspections, and filed my reports with the Coast Guard. At night, I would sit by the bell and listen for their warnings. When fog rolled in, I would watch them work ethereal figures moving along the shoreline, keeping vigil for vessels that might stray too close to the rocks. Sometimes, on the clearest nights, they would simply talk. They told me about the world. They remembered, about sailing ships and steam vessels, about a time when navigation was more art than science. They shared stories of their families, their dreams that had been cut short by cold Atlantic water, and gradually, I realized that I was no longer just a lighthouse. Keepery was their companion, their link to the world of the living, their confirmation that their sacrifice still mattered. It was on a night in early December that we faced our first real test. The fog had been building all day, rolling in from the northeast in thick gray walls that reduced visibility to mere yards. By evening, I could barely see the water from the lighthouse gallery, and the automated foghorn was sounding its warning every 30 seconds. At 11:30, I took my usual position by the bell pavilion and waited. The 9 companions materialized. Earlier than usual, their forms more solid in the thick mist. "Tonight is different," Thomas said, his voice urgent. "There's a vessel coming, a fishing boat with 4 souls aboard. Their GPS has failed, and they're running on compass alone. They don't know about the shoals." "How far out?" I asked. "Perhaps 20 minutes at their current speed," said Michael. "They're following what they think is the safe channel, but the fog has them confused. They'll strike the rocks unless we warn them." At 11:47, the bell began to ring, but instead of the usual 9 tolls, it continued deep resonant notes that carried across the water with supernatural clarity. I could see my companions now, all 9 of them standing round the bell, their ghostly hands somehow touching the bronze surface, their combined will making it sing. And then, faintly through the fog, I heard the sound of a diesel engine. The fishing vessel emerged from the mist like a gray phantom, its running lights barely visible in the thick air. It was heading directly for the submerged rocks that had claimed the Dorothea 137 years earlier. The bell continued to ring, its urgent tolling cutting through the fog like a knife. I grabbed my emergency radio and tried to raise the vessel, but got only static. Their communications were down, just as the companions had said. The boat continued its approach, and I could see now that it was going to strike the rocks in less than 5 minutes. "Ring louder," I urged my ghostly friends. "They have to hear it." The 9 sailors redoubled their efforts, and the bell's voice became something beyond sounded, was a vibration that seemed to travel through the water itself, through the fog, through the very air. And finally, miraculously, I saw the fishing boat's lights change course. They had heard the warning. They were turning away from the rocks, heading back toward deeper water. We watched until their lights disappeared into the fog, safe and sound. For more souls who will see the sun rise, said David, and his smile was visible even in his translucent state. Thank you, I said to them, all of you, for letting me be part of this. Thank you, said Thomas, for understanding, for not trying to silence us, for knowing that some duties transcend death. The weeks that followed brought more foggy nights, more vessels in need of warning, more confirmation that the 9 sailors of the Dorothea were still serving as guardians of the coast. I began to document these incidents in my logbook, creating a record that future keepers might understand. I wrote about the bell that rang without mechanism, about the companions who appeared in the fog, about the sacred duty of warning the living away from the rocks that had claimed so many lives. But I also began to notice changes in myself. The isolation that had once seemed healing was becoming something deeper, more profound. I found myself looking forward to the fog, to the nightly appearances of my ghostly companions, to the sense of purpose that came from participating in their endless vigil. The world of the living, the weekly supply runs, the radio communications with the Coast Guard, the occasional visit from maintenance crews began to feel distant and unreal. It was Margaret's voice that brought me back from the edge. I was sitting by the Bell Pavilion on a particularly thick night in January, watching the 9 companions keep their eternal watch, when I heard her speak my name. Thomas, she said, and her voice was warm and concerned. Nothing like the cold tones of the drowned sailors. Thomas, you're forgetting something important. I turned, and there she was, not translucent like the others, but solid and real. Her gray hair catching the light from the lighthouse beacon. Margaret, but you single quotes re ... Yes. But not bound to any place, not trapped by any duty, except love. She sat beside me on the damp stone. You're beginning to think that joining them would be easier than returning to the world of the living. I can see it in your eyes. They need someone who understands, I said. Someone who won't try to silence the bell. They've had many keepers. Over the years, Thomas, some understood, some didn't. But they survived, and they continued their work. They don't need you to join them. They need you to live, to be their advocate among the living, to document their purpose so that future keepers will understand. I looked at the 9 sailors who had turned to watch our conversation with expressions of deep sadness. She's right, said Michael. We've been selfish, keeping you here with us so often. We forgot that the living need to remain among the living. Your duty is to tend the light, said Thomas. Ours is to ring the bell. Both are sacred, but they exist in different realms. Margaret took my hand, and her touch was warm and real. You've grieved for me, and that's right and proper. But grief isn't meant to become a permanent home. It's meant to be a bridge between what was and what can still be. I don't know how to live without you, I admitted. The same way you lived before you met me, she said with that gentle smile I remembered so well. One day at a time, with purpose and hope, and the knowledge that love doesn't end just because life does. She stayed with me until dawn, and when the sun finally broke through the fog, both she and the 9 sailors faded like mist. But I understood now that I had a choice to make, not between life and death, but between isolation and connection, between hiding from the world and engaging with it. The next day, I drove into town and spent time with real people. I had lunch at the diner, visited Mrs. Henley at the Historical Society, even attended the evening service at the small coastal church. I began to establish routines that connected me to the living world, while still honoring my responsibility to the lighthouse and my unique relationship with its supernatural guardians. The 9 sailors still appear on foggy nights, and the bell still rings when vessels need warning, but now I understand that I'm not meant to join them, I'm meant to be their witness, their voice in the world of the living, their guarantee that their sacrifice and service will not be forgotten. In the months since that January night, I've prevented 3 potential tragedies by radioing warnings to vessels that might not have heard the bell clearly enough. I've documented dozens of incidents where the bell's supernatural ringing turned boats away from danger, and I've begun writing a comprehensive history of Beacon Point Light Station, ensuring that future keepers will understand the sacred nature of their assignment. The bell on the shoreline rings for the dead. Yes, but it rings to protect the living. And sometimes, if you listen carefully on a foggy night, you can hear the gratitude in its bronze voice. The eternal dedication of 9 souls who refused to let their death be meaningless. The rain is still falling outside your window, gentle and persistent, like the fog that rolls in from the Atlantic. Close your eyes now and rest peacefully. Know that somewhere, dedicated guardians are keeping watch through the dark hours, ensuring that travelers find safe harbor and that those we've lost continue to serve in ways beyond our understanding. The light always shines, the warning always sounds, and love transcends even the deepest waters. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the sound of bells ringing clear across peaceful waters, guiding everyone safely home. I was driving through Vermont in February, fleeing a life that had collapsed around me like a house of cards. The divorce papers were signed, the job was gone, and I had nowhere to go except forward into the kind of winter that makes you question every decision that brought you to that moment. The snow was falling heavy and thick when I saw the sign for the Black Ridge in hand-painted wood that looked like it had been weathered by decades of mountain storms. The inn itself was a massive Victorian structure, 3 stories of dark wood and steep gables that seemed to crouch against the mountainside like something that had grown there naturally. Warm light spilled from windows that glowed amber in the falling snow, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys into the gray evening sky. It looked like the kind of place that existed outside of time, where travelers had been seeking shelter for generations. The proprietor was a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Thorne, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She greeted me at the front desk with the kind of genuine warmth that felt increasingly rare in the world. "Terrible night to be on the roads," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of a New England accent. "You're lucky you found us when you... Did the pass closes when the snow gets this heavy?" I signed the register with numb fingers, grateful for the warmth and the promise of a bed for the night. The lobby was exactly what you'd expect from a place like this. Persian rugs over polished hardwood, a massive stone fireplace where logs crackled and sparked, antique furniture that looked like it had stories to tell. "I have a lovely room on the 2nd floor," Eleanor said, studying the registry book. "Room 14 has a beautiful view of the valley, and the fireplace works wonderfully." Something made me hesitate. "What about room 17? The question surprised even me. Hadn't planned to ask for a specific room, hadn't even known the inn had a room 17. But the number had popped into my head with such clarity that it felt like someone else had spoken. Eleanor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow passing across her features like a cloud over the sun. "Room 17 is, well, it's available, but I wouldn't recommend it. The heating can be unreliable, and it's quite isolated at the end of the 3rd floor corridor." "I don't mind the cold," I said, though I couldn't explain why I was insisting. "And isolation sounds perfect right now." She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but if you find it unsuitable, please don't hesitate to let me know. We can always move you to something more comfortable." She handed me an old-fashioned brass key, heavier than it should have been, worn smooth by countless hands. "3rd floor, all the way to the end of the hall. Dinner is served until 9, if you're interested." The staircase was narrow and steep, each step creaking under my weight in a different tone, like the inn was playing some ancient wooden symphony. The 2nd floor hallway was lined with doors, warm light seeping from beneath most of them, the comfortable sounds of other guests settling in for the night. But the stairs to the 3rd floor felt different, colder, quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath. The 3rd floor corridor was dimly lit, by old-fashioned wall sconces that cast dancing shadows on the dark wood paneling. Room 17 was indeed, at the very end, isolated from the other rooms by what felt like an unusual amount of space. The brass number on the door was tarnished with age, and the wood around the lock showed the wear patterns of decades of use. The key turned easily, and the door swung open to reveal a room that was both exactly what I'd expected and somehow more. It was larger than I'd anticipated, with a high ceiling and tall windows that looked out over the snow-covered valley. The furniture was antique but well-maintained, a four-poster bed with a thick quilt, a writing desk positioned near the windows, a comfortable armchair beside a small fireplace that someone had already prepared with kindling and logs. But there was something else in the room, something I couldn't quite name. A feeling of presence, as if the space had been recently occupied and still held the echo of whoever had been there. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something sweet and melancholy, like flowers left too long in water. I set my bag down and went to start the fire, grateful for the warmth it would provide. As the flames caught and began to dance, the room seemed to come alive around me. Shadows moved across the walls in patterns that didn't quite match the flickering light, and I could have sworn I heard something, a soft sound, like pages turning or fabric rustling. I unpacked my few belongings and tried to settle in, but found myself drawn repeatedly to the writing desk. It was positioned perfectly to catch the light from both the fire and the windows, and there was something about it that suggested long hours of use. The wood was worn smooth in certain spots, and there were faint indentations in the surface, as if someone had pressed hard while writing, leaving permanent impressions in the grain. I ran my fingers over these marks, trying to make sense of the patterns, when I noticed something odd. The desk had a small drawer, barely visible unless you were looking for it, tucked into the space between the main surface and the decorative trim. The drawer was stuck, warped with age and humidity, but with some gentle pressure, it finally slid. Open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and covered in elegant handwriting. A letter, though the ink had faded to a pale brown that was barely legible in the firelight. I carried it closer to the flames, squinting to make out the words. "My dearest William," it began. "I write this knowing it may be the last letter I ever send, the last words you will ever receive from me. The consumption grows worse each day, and Dr. Morrison says there is little hope left. But I am not writing to burden you with my suffering. I am writing to tell you that I have found peace here at the Blackridge Inn, in this room where I have spent my final weeks." The letter was dated October 15th, 1923, and signed with all my love, Margaret. I read it 3 times, the words seeming to burn themselves into my memory. Margarita, woman dying of tuberculosis nearly a century ago, spending her final days in this very room. The letter spoke of her gratitude for the kindness of the inn's staff, her appreciation for the beauty of the autumn mountains, and her hope that William would remember her not as she was at the end, but as she had been in their happiest moments together. But it was the final paragraph that made my hands tremble. "I have asked Mrs. Blackridge to place this letter in the desk drawer after I am gone, in hopes that someday you might find your way here and discover these words. If you are reading this, my darling, know that I am still here in some way, that this room holds the best parts of who I was. Look for me in the morning light through the windows, in the warmth of the fire on cold nights, in the peace that settles over this place when the snow falls heavy and the world grows quiet." I set the letter down with shaking hands. Mrs. Blackridge, that must have been Eleanor's predecessor, perhaps her grandmother or great-grandmother. The letter had been waiting in that drawer for 100 years, waiting for William to find it. But William had never come, and instead, it had found me. I should have felt disturbed, should have been unnerved by the discovery. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, not for myself, but for Margaret, who had died alone in this room, and for William, who had never received her final message. The weight of that undelivered love, that unfinished story, seemed to press against my chest like a physical thing. That night, I dreamed of a woman in a white nightgown, sitting at the writing desk by the window. She was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. In the dream, she was writing by candlelight, her pen moving steadily across the paper, occasionally pausing to look out at the snow-covered mountains. There was a peacefulness about her, a serenity that spoke of acceptance rather than despair. When she finished writing, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the desk drawer. Then she turned to look at me, and her eyes were kind but infinitely sad. "You found it," she said, her voice soft as falling snow. "After all these years, someone finally found it." "I'm not William," I said, though in the dream this seemed like a reasonable conversation to be having. "I know," she replied, "but you needed to find it anyway. Some messages aren't meant only for the person they're addressed to. Sometimes they're meant for whoever needs to hear them most." I woke to gray morning light filtering through the windows, and the sound of snow still falling steadily outside. The letter was on the nightstand where I'd left it, proof that the previous evening hadn't been a dream, but there was something else, a faint scent of lavender in the air. Stronger now than it had been the night before. I dressed and went downstairs for breakfast, finding Eleanor in the dining room arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. She looked up as I entered, her eyes immediately going to my face with an expression of concern. "How did you sleep?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I found something," I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. "In the desk drawer. A letter from someone named Margaret." Eleanor's face went very still. She set down the flowers and walked over to where I stood, her eyes fixed on the yellowed paper in my hands. "Margaret Henley," she said softly. "She died in that room in 1923. Tuberculosis. She'd come here hoping the mountain air would help, but... ... She trailed off, shaking her head. "My great-grandmother told me about her. She was alone at the end. Her fiancé was overseas, fighting in some conflict or another. He never made it back." "William," I said. Eleanor nodded. "She asked my great-grandmother to save the letter, in case he ever came looking for her. But he never did. We've kept the room exactly as it was when she passed, and every few years, someone finds that letter. Always someone who needs to find it." "What do you mean? Do you mean?" She studied my face with those perceptive eyes. "People don't usually ask for room 17 specifically, but when they do, it's because something draws them there. Margaret seems to call to people who are carrying their own grief, their own unfinished business." I thought about my divorce, about the job I'd lost, about the way I'd been driving through the snow with no destination in mind. "I'm not grieving someone's death, aren't you?" Eleanor asked gently. "Grief isn't just for the dead. Sometimes we grieve the life we thought we'd have, the person we thought we'd be." Margaret understood that kind of loss too. I spent another 3 days at the Blackridge Inn, snowed in by the storm that had brought me there. Each night, I felt Margaret's presence more strongly, not frightening or intrusive, but comforting, like having a friend who understood what it meant to face an uncertain future alone. I found myself talking to her as I sat by the fire, telling her about my failed marriage, my lost career, my fear of starting over at 40-5, and somehow, in that room where she had faced her own ending with such grace, I began to find my own peace. The letter she'd written to William became a kind of meditation for me, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we can choose how we face what's coming. Margaret had died alone, but she hadn't died bitter or afraid. She'd found beauty in her final weeks, gratitude for small kindnesses, hope that love would transcend even death. On my last morning, I woke to brilliant sunshine and the sound of snow sliding off the roof in great, wet chunks. The storm had passed, the roads were clear, and it was time to continue my journey. But before I left, I had something to do. I sat at the writing desk where Margaret had spent her final days and wrote my own letter, not to someone I'd lost, but to someone I was trying to find. I wrote to the person I wanted to become, the life I wanted to build from the wreckage of the old one. I wrote about forgiveness and second chances, about the courage it takes to start over when everything familiar has been stripped away. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the desk drawer, next to Margaret's century-old message to William. Perhaps someday, another lost traveler would find both letters and understand that they weren't alone in their struggle to make sense of endings and beginnings. Eleanor was waiting for me at the front desk when I came down with my bag. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that suggested she'd seen this transformation before. "You look different," she said, as I settled my bill. "I feel different," I admitted. "That room, Margaret. There's something special about this place." "She helps people," Eleanor said simply. "Has for 100 years now. My great-grandmother used to say that some souls are too generous to rest completely. They find ways to keep giving, even after they're gone." I handed her the room key, that heavy brass weight that had unlocked more than just a door. "Will you tell me something? How many people have found her letter over the years?" Eleanor considered the question. "Dozens. I'd say maybe more. And every one of them has left something better than they found it. Margaret has a gift for showing people that endings don't have to be bitter, that there's grace to be found even in the hardest goodbyes." As I loaded my car and prepared to leave, I looked back at the inn one more time. Room 17's windows caught the morning light, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure there, a young woman in white, raising her hand in farewell. I've been back to the Black Ridge Inn 3 times since then, always requesting Room 17. Each visit, I find Margaret's letter exactly where she left it, waiting for the next person who needs to discover that they're not alone in their struggle with loss and renewal. And each time, I add my own small contribution to the desk drawer. Sometimes a letter, sometimes a pressed flower, sometimes just a note of gratitude for the peace I found in that room. The inn has become a pilgrimage site for me, a place I return to when life feels too heavy or uncertain. Eleanor always welcomes me back with that knowing smile, and Margaret's presence remains as comforting as ever. I've learned that some places hold more than just memories. They hold the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has ever sought shelter there, everyone who has ever found healing in their quiet spaces. Room 17 still has its secrets, but they're the kind of secrets that heal rather than haunt, in a world that often feels harsh and unforgiving. It's a reminder that kindness can transcend death, that love can outlast the physical forms it inhabits, and that sometimes the most profound comfort comes from strangers who understand our pain, because they've walked through their own darkness and emerged with grace and tact. Tonight, as I listen to the rain against my own windows, I think of Margaret and the letter she wrote by candlelight in a room high above a snow-covered valley. I think of all the travelers who have found her words when they needed them most, and I'm grateful for the mysterious ways that healing finds us. Even in the places we least expect it, the Black Ridge Inn still stands, still welcomes weary travelers seeking shelter from life's storms. And in Room 17, a generous spirit continues to offer the gift she's been giving for a century, the reminder that we are never truly alone, that our stories matter, and that sometimes the most beautiful endings are really just beginnings. In disguise, a fog rolled in. I think it brought someone with it. Listen to the rain against your window tonight, each drop a whispered secret from the sky. Let it lull you into that drowsy space between waking and sleeping, where the impossible seems possible, and the mind opens to mysteries it usually keeps locked away. As you settle deeper into your pillows, I want to share something that happened to me last autumn, when the fog came rolling in from the sea like a living thing, thick and purposeful, carrying more than just moisture on its breath. It's a story about how sometimes the weather brings unexpected visitors, how isolation can play tricks on your mind, and how the line between imagination and reality becomes as thin as morning mist. Close your eyes and let the rhythm of the rain carry you to that night when everything changed. When I learned that fog isn't always empty, and that sometimes when you're alone, you're not really alone at all, I moved to the lighthouse keeper's cottage on Beacon Point in September, drawn by the promise of solitude and the romantic notion of living where the land meets the sea. The lighthouse itself had been automated for decades, its beams sweeping across the waters without human intervention. But the small cottage at its base was available for rent at a price that seemed too good to be true. The landlord, Mrs. Carstairs, warned me about the isolation, the harsh winter weather, and the way the fog could roll in without warning, sometimes lasting for days. "It's not for everyone," she said as we walked around the property, her gray hair whipping in the salt wind. "The last tenant lasted only 3 months. Said he couldn't handle the loneliness, but you seem like the type who appreciates solitude." She was right. After years of city living, of constant noise and endless distractions, the idea of being alone with nothing but the ocean and my thoughts felt like a luxury. The cottage was small but well appointed, with thick stone walls that had weathered over a century of storms, wide windows that framed spectacular views of the coastline, and a fireplace that promised warmth during the cold months ahead. My first weeks at Beacon Point were everything I'd hoped for. I spent my days writing, reading, and taking long walks along the rocky shore. The lighthouse beam became my nightly companion, its regular sweep across my windows as comforting as a heartbeat. I fell asleep to the sound of waves and woke to the cries of seabirds, feeling more at peace than I had in years. October brought the first serious fog. I woke one morning to find the world beyond my windows completely erased, replaced by a wall of gray so thick I couldn't see the lighthouse tower 50 feet away. The fog was different from anything I'd experienced before, not the wispy, ethereal mist of mountain mornings, but something dense and almost solid, as if the air itself had turned to cotton. Mrs. Carstairs had prepared me for this. "When the fog comes," she'd said, "it can last for days. Make sure you have enough supplies, and don't try to drive. The road can be treacherous when you can't see more than a few feet ahead." I'd stocked up on groceries and had plenty of books to keep me occupied, so I settled in to wait out the weather. The fog brought with it an even deeper silence than usual, muffling the sound of the waves and creating a cocoon of quiet that seemed to press against the cottage walls. Even the lighthouse beam was invisible, though I could hear the faint mechanical whir of the rotating light somewhere. Above it was, on the second day of fog, that I first heard the footsteps. I was reading by the fireplace when the sound reached me, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, moving slowly along the path that led from the road to the cottage. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, as if someone was being careful not to stumble in the limited visibility. I looked out the window, but saw nothing except the impenetrable gray wall. The footsteps stopped directly outside my front door. I waited for a knock, for some sign of what the visitor wanted, but there was only silence. After several minutes, I heard the footsteps resume, circling the cottage slowly, as if someone was examining the building from every angle. The sound grew fainter as the person moved to the back of the house, then louder again as they completed their circuit and returned to the front. I opened the door and called out, "Hello, can I help you?" But my voice seemed to be swallowed by the fog, and there was no response. The footsteps had stopped again, and I had the unsettling feeling that someone was standing just beyond my vision, watching me. "If you need help, I have a phone," I called out, feeling slightly foolish for talking to empty air. "The visibility is terrible. You shouldn't be walking around in this weather." Still no response. I waited a few more minutes, then closed the door and locked it, telling myself that I'd probably imagined the whole thing. Fog could play tricks on the senses, I knew. Sounds could carry strangely in heavy air. and isolation could make the mind conjure companions where none existed. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time they were accompanied by other sounds, the soft scrape of fabric against stone, the faint whistle of breath, and something that might have been humming, a low, tuneless melody that seemed to drift through the fog like smoke. I pressed my ear to the window and listened carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the sounds. But they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The humming was the most disturbing part. It wasn't random, there was a pattern too. A repetitive sequence of notes that suggested a song I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of melody that gets stuck in your head, the kind you find yourself humming without realizing it. But there was something deeply unsettling about hearing it float through the fog outside my windows. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my pulse quicken. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, that the fog was carrying sounds from somewhere else, maybe a radio playing in a car stuck on the road, or a fisherman's boat lost offshore. But the sounds were too organized, too purposeful. Someone was definitely out there, moving around my cottage with what seemed like intimate knowledge of the terrain. The fog persisted for 5 days, and during that entire time, my nocturnal visitor never missed a night. The routine was always the same: footsteps beginning around 10 p.m., a slow circuit of the cottage, then the humming that would continue until well past midnight. I began to anticipate the sounds, finding myself unable to concentrate on anything else as evening approached. On the 4th night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I waited until I heard the familiar footsteps, then quietly opened the back door and slipped outside. The fog was so thick that I immediately lost my bearings, despite having lived in the cottage for over a month. The world had become a gray void where up and down were the only reliable directions. I felt my way along the stone wall of the cottage, moving toward where I thought the footsteps were coming from. The fog muffled all sound except my own breathing and the soft whisper of my clothes against the stone. I stopped frequently to listen, but the footsteps had ceased the moment I stepped outside, as if my presence had frightened them away. "I know. You're out there," I said into the gray void. "What do you want? Why are you watching my house?" The fog seemed to absorb my words, giving them a flat, lifeless quality that made me sound like I was talking to myself, which, I was beginning to worry, might actually be the case. I was about to give up and feel my way back to the door when I heard the humming again, much closer than before. It seemed to be coming from directly above me, as if someone was standing on the cottage roof. I looked up but saw nothing except the same impenetrable gray, and gradually the humming faded away, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. When I finally made it back inside, I was shaking not from cold, but from a deep, instinctive fear that I couldn't explain. I poured myself a generous glass of whiskey and sat by the fire, trying to make sense of what was happening. The logical part of my mind insisted that isolation and fog were playing tricks on my perception, that I was probably hearing ordinary sounds and transforming them into something sinister. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that still remembered when humans were prey animals, was screaming that something was very wrong. I called Mrs. Carstairs the next morning, using the cottage's landline, since my cell phone had no signal in the heavy fog. She listened patiently as I described the sounds I'd been hearing. The sense of being watched, the feeling that someone was circling the cottage every night. "Oh dear," she said when I finished, and there was something in her tone that made my stomach drop. I was hoping, ... Well, I suppose I should have mentioned this before you moved in. Mentioned what? There have been reports over the years. Other tenants, I mean. People who stayed in the cottage during heavy fog. They've described similar experiences: footsteps, humming, the feeling of being observed. Most of them dismissed it as imagination, but ... double quotes, but what? Mrs. Carstairs sighed deeply. There was a lighthouse keeper who lived in that cottage back in the 1940s, Thomas Whitmore. One night during a particularly heavy fog, he left the cottage to check on something. His log entry mentioned hearing distress calls from a ship offshore. He never came back. They found his body 3 days later when the fog cleared, at the bottom of the cliffs about a quarter mile from the lighthouse. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. You think he's still out there? Still walking around in the fog? I don't know what to think, Mrs. Carstairs admitted. But Thomas was known for his dedication to duty. Even in the worst weather, he would make his rounds every night, checking the lighthouse equipment, ensuring everything was in working order. The humming. His wife mentioned in her testimony that he always hummed while he worked, said it helped him concentrate. After hanging up, I spent the day researching Thomas Whitmore online, using the cottage's spotty internet connection. Story checked out he'd been the lighthouse keeper from 1938 to 1943, when he'd vanished during a fierce autumn storm. The newspaper reports described him as conscientious and reliable, never missing his nightly inspections even in the most treacherous conditions. What struck me most was a quote from his wife in the local newspaper. Thomas never could rest when the fog was thick. He said it made him nervous, not being able to see the ships that might need help. He'd pace the house for hours, humming that old song his father taught him, until he finally had to go out and check everything himself. That night, armed with this new knowledge, I waited for the footsteps with a different kind of anticipation. When they came, right on schedule, I listened more carefully to the pattern. The sounds were indeed systematica, slow circuit of the cottage. Pauses at what I now realized were the points where Thomas would have checked various pieces of equipment. Then the longer pause at the front where he would have looked out toward the sea. The humming, when it began, sounded less threatening now that I understood its purpose. It was a working song, something to keep rhythm while performing routine tasks. I found myself almost feeling sorry for Thomas Whitmore, trapped in an endless loop of duty, unable to rest even in death. On the 5th night of fog, I made a decision that might have been foolish, but felt necessary. When I heard the footsteps begin their circuit, I opened the front door and spoke into the gray void. "Thomas," I said quietly. "Thomas Whitmore, I know you're out there. I know you're just trying to do your job." The footsteps stopped immediately, and the silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to press against my ear. Then, very faintly, I heard a voice not speaking, but humming, the same repetitive melody I'd been hearing for days. But now, it sounded questioning, uncertain, as if someone was trying to remember something important. "The lighthouse is working fine," I continued, hoping I was doing the right thing. "The light is on, it's rotating properly, and there are no ships in distress. Everything is as it should be. You can rest now." The humming grew louder, more agitated, and I realized that Thomas didn't believe me. How could he, when he couldn't see the lighthouse beam through the fog? In life, he would have needed to physically inspect the equipment to be sure it was functioning. Death hadn't changed that compulsion. I went back inside and found a flashlight, then returned to the doorway. "Thomas, I'm going to show you that everything is working. Follow my light." I clicked on the flashlight and began walking toward the lighthouse tower, the beam cutting through the fog just far enough for me to see a few feet ahead. Behind me, I heard the soft crunch of footsteps following at a respectful distance. The humming had stopped, replaced by what sounded like quiet, nervous breathing. The lighthouse beam was invisible from ground level, swallowed by the fog before it could travel more than a few yards. But when I reached the base of the tower and shone my flashlight upward, we could both see the powerful rotating light sweeping steadily through its programmed pattern. "You see?" I said to the presence I couldn't see but knew was there. "It's working perfectly. The ships are safe. You've done your job." The silence that followed was different from before. It felt expectant, hopeful, like the pause before good news. Then, so faintly, I almost missed it, I heard a whispered "thank you" carried on the fog-heavy air. the footsteps began moving away. Not in the circular pattern I'd grown accustomed to, but in a straight line toward the cliffs. I followed the sound as far as I dared, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the gray wall ahead of me. The footsteps grew fainter and fainter, until finally they faded entirely, leaving me alone in the fog with only the distant sound of waves breaking against the rocks below. I made my way back to the cottage, feeling lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, for the first time in 5 days, I slept without interruption. There were no footsteps, no humming, no sense of being watched. The fog had reclaimed its natural silence. The weather began to clear the next morning, the fog thinning, gradually until patches of blue sky appeared like windows in the gray. By afternoon, the sun was shining, and I could see for miles along the coastline. The world looked washed clean, as if the fog had taken more than just moisture with it when it departed. I never saw or heard Thomas Whitmore again, but I did find something a few days later while walking along the cliff path. Partially hidden, under a pile of driftwood was an old brass compass, tarnished with age and salt air. The inscription on the back read T. Whitmore, 1944, safe passages in all weather. I cleaned the compass and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace, where it catches the light from the lighthouse beam each night as it sweeps across the cottage windows. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in heavy from the sea, I take the compass down and hold it, feeling its weight in my hands and thinking about duty, dedication, and the ways we continue to serve others even after we're gone. Mrs. Carstairs was pleased when I called to tell her about my experience. I always suspected Thomas was still around, she said. He was that kind of man, couldn't stand the thought of leaving his post unattended. I'm glad you were able to help him find peace. The cottage feels different now, more settled somehow. The isolation that once seemed daunting now feels companionable, as if I'm not the first person to find solace in this place where the land meets the sea. When storms come and the fog rolls in thick, I no longer worry about strange sounds in the night. I know that Thomas Whitmore has finally completed his last round, that he's found the rest he'd been denied for so many decades. But I've learned something else during my time at Beacon Point, that fog is more than just weather. It's a veil between worlds, a bridge between what was and what is. It carries with it the memories of all the lives that have touched a place, all the stories that have unfolded in its embrace. Sometimes those stories are still being told, still looking for someone to listen, still hoping for an ending that makes sense. The lighthouse beam sweeps across my windows as I write this, its steady rhythm as reliable as a heartbeat. Outside, the first wisps of fog are beginning to gather on the horizon, and I can hear the distant sound of a foghorn warning ships of the rocky coast. But I'm not afraid of what the fog might bring. I've learned that sometimes the most frightening things are just lost souls looking for a way home. And sometimes the greatest service we can provide is simply bearing witness to their journey. So, as you lie in bed tonight, listening to the rain wash the world clean, remember that every storm carries stories. Every weather pattern holds memories. The fog outside your window might be hiding more than just the familiar landscape. It might be carrying visitors from times past, travelers who've lost their way and need a gentle voice to guide them toward the light. Listen carefully to the sounds around you. Pay attention to the rhythms in the rain, the patterns in the wind. You might hear something that doesn't quite belong to your world, something that needs your help to find its proper place in the story of things. And if you do, don't be afraid. Sometimes the most important conversations happen with people we can't see, and sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply acknowledging that they're there. The fog is rolling in thicker now, transforming the world outside into a mystery. But mysteries don't have to be frightening. They can be invitations to understand something deeper about the places we inhabit, the history we share, and the connections that bind us across time and space. Sleep well, and remember, You ever find yourself wrapped in fog? You're not alone. You're part of a story that's much larger than yourself, surrounded by all the souls who've walked this earth before you. All of them hoping their stories will be remembered, all of them grateful for any kindness you can spare. Let the rain be your lullaby tonight, and let it carry away any fears you might have about the unknown. The fog will lift eventually, as it always does, and when it does, it will reveal the world made new, washed clean by weather and time, and the gentle passage of spirits finding their way home.